Hi, thank you so much for clicking this video. This is a compilation video. In other words, it's a connection or a long format series of episodes that are all interconnected by the same topic. If you have never watched any of these videos, then this is the best way to experience this presentation because the editing is snappier. I cut some of the sections that were redundant, and also I've removed all interruptions, whether it be sponsors, whether it be Patreon mentions. It is one long, continuous presentation. Now, I hope you enjoy it. If it's not a topic you're interested in, one thing you could do to support the channel if you want would be to just let it play in the background while you're doing other things, and I would really appreciate that. Without further ado, I'll see you later in the video. Enjoy.
Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and today we are talking about my new Brigandine made by Alexei Perebenos, a fantastic and extremely talented craftsman. Link to his Facebook page in the description. Okay, but what is a Brigandine? How is it made? Who used it? How popular was it on the medieval field? And what pros and cons does it have when compared to other forms of armor used in the period? We've got a lot of things to say. This is really exciting. Well, first and foremost, my Brigandine is based off the Leeds Brigandine, and I'll just show you a picture of the original, which is a late 15th century sort of Brigandine. And we're talking about, generally speaking, 1450 to 1470. That will be the era that we're talking about, and therefore, by this time, in the late 15th century, the Brigandine has transformed into a more complex sort of armor in its construction. It's made of many different plates of, in my case, hardened and tempered spring steel with a percentage of carbon of 0.65%. All of my plates in this case have also been tinned, so they are rust proof, and this is a practice that could have been done historically. In fact, tinning for both decorative and preservation reasons has been done since the Roman period, but it being an extremely lengthy and complicated process, it does bring up the price quite a lot. The plates are then riveted onto a backing, a fabric backing, which in this case, if you look at the inside of the Brigandine, is made of canvas. And when we say canvas in a medieval context, we're talking about a mixture of flax and cannabis, but it could have been also backed to hemp. That would have also been historically accurate. But as you can appreciate, the outside is also being coated. So the outside fabric for my specimen here is hand-spun silk velvet. It was made in Uzbekistan by hand, a very lengthy process for a very high-end product. And this is actually very coherent. It's exactly the same as medieval velvet, also in terms of the overall width. However, if you're more on a budget, felt would also be historically accurate, and there are also other options for the outside fabric. Now, what makes a late 15th century Brigandine labor intensive is the fact that all of the many different plates have been riveted onto the garment through these rivets, and in fact, in this case, they are made of brass. These were handmade by Alexei Perebenos. There are about 2,000 of them on my Brigandine. Now, the closing mechanism, it closes in the front. Some Brigandines would have closed in the back. I chose one to close in the front because simply it's easier to put on your own, which is one of the reasons why it's normally associated to common soldiers, but that doesn't mean that a rich medieval nobleman who already had a full plate harness couldn't decide, hey, that Brigandine from that soldier is very nice, how much is that? I want it. And that is because it's very stylish, very fashionable, just like Shad said on his video. Hello Shad, I love your channel. Style also plays a part. Of course, functionality is the most important thing, and we're going to talk about shape. The shape of this Brigandine specifically. Still, where is my mail shirt? I mean, shouldn't I be wearing a shirt of mail underneath my Brigandine? Isn't that the minimum requirement for a soldier? Doesn't the fact that I'm wearing my Brigandine over my arming doublet make it ultimately historically inaccurate? No. Both in the 14th century and in the 15th century, the minimum requirement for a soldier is either a Brigandine or a mail shirt. Better if you've got both, but we're talking about minimum requirement. And if we look at iconography, yes, sometimes we do see soldiers wearing a Brigandine, full helmet, sword, shield, what have you, mail shirt underneath, absolutely fine. But we also find people wearing a Brigandine simply over a doublet, like this picture here. And I'd like to underline, I don't actually think that that's not a gambesson, that's a doublet. They could be an arming doublet like mine. If you look, it really looks like mine. We've got the same collar, the same puffy sleeves, closure mechanism. It's probably an arming doublet, but since I don't see the points, and I will be talking about the points on this video, and I'll tell you where I got them, how they're made and whatnot. Since I don't see the points, it might actually be a civilian doublet. But suffice to say, he does not have a mail shirt. And that's not the only case. We do see oftentimes people wearing the Brigandine, a helmet, and then they've just got leather shoes, hose, and doublets. And that's what I wanted to show you here. This is an absolutely coherent and accurate, very light kit, if you will. I'm not gonna be shot at with a crossbow, I don't think, so I think it's gonna be okay for me. But style and fashion are also important, and a Brigandine not only brings a lot of that because it's absolutely beautiful. You can have many different colors, such as I want to say royal blue of my Brigandine, and I specifically chose the brass buckles and the brass rivets because I love the contrast of the dull golden look of brass together with this blue. I could have made them of steel, I just prefer this combination. But a Brigandine also brings in other advantages such as flexibility and mobility, and we will talk about this later on more in details. Also, these are absolutely fine. The straps and buckles are absolutely fine on a Brigandine. Generally speaking, you wouldn't really see them in arming doublets and gambesons because normally they are either laced up or buttoned up. In this case, I've got fabric buttons in my arming doublet. But for the Brigandine, they're absolutely fine and coherent. Let's talk about the shape of a Brigandine. Now, you see, my Brigandine, it being a late 15th century type, it's very important for this period to have the proper shape. So if you look at it, you see that it tapers at the waist in sort of a V-like shape that usually is referred to as an hourglass shape in the late 14th century. And then this goes to the exasperated and exaggerated wasp waist that we see in late 15th century armor. Now, my Brigandine does have shape, it's very correct, but it's important to say that in the future, whenever I'll order another Brigandine from Alexei, I will ask him to actually go even further and push it even a bit more, to actually make it taper even more. The fact that my Brigandine has shape and so it looks like this means that the weight is now on my natural waist, and which is the point of balance, the natural point of balance of my body, and therefore, believe me, I do not feel it at all. There is nothing whatsoever on my shoulders, and that is why shape in armor is extremely important. And to know that your armor, whether it be a breastplate, backplate and full plate, or whether it be a Brigandine, has got the right sort of tapering, then this is a very easy test to do. When you put it on, do you feel a slight pressure in your natural waist, and does it feel ever so slightly uncomfortable? If the answer is yes, your Brigandine or your armor has good shape, because you do need to feel slightly uncomfortable. And in fact, that should actually start with your arming doublet, and that is one point that I do need to improve for my arming doublet and make a small modification, because even the arming doublet should push you a little bit in the natural waist, because this really makes a universe of difference in the weight distribution of the armor. Now, generally speaking, the Brigandine does provide some advantages. For example, it's a lot more flexible. In fact, it's a bit of an in-between the flexibility of mail and the flexibility of plate. The Brigandine stands in between. It's a sort of compromise between the two realities. It's more protective than mail, but it's less rigid than plate. So it's not as protective as plate, but it does provide more mobility. And I believe that this could have been something that was sought after even by noblemen who could afford full plate. Again, maybe smaller numbers. Generally speaking, common soldiers will be wearing this. But then again, this is a replica of a high-end Brigandine, so it does make sense that a nobleman, perhaps he's in the camp and he decides, hey, today I don't think the enemy is going to attack. Maybe I can see a couple of archers over there just looking for an opportunity to strike or to, snipe someone down. So I don't want to have completely no armor, but I'll just put on my Brigandine. It's a lot easier, and perhaps I'll just wear my barbute, which is again a light cavalry action helmet. It's not what you would wear when you're going for a full charge shock cavalry sort of action. For that, I would definitely use an armored, but even a medieval knight would have had several different possible configurations for his armor. You don't have to imagine there is a medieval knight and he's got one helmet and he's got his full plate and that's that. No, you have a lot of possible configurations, and again, for example, if I were in a camp, perhaps I would just wear my barbute, because it does still provide good protection, but I can breathe, I can speak, I can see. It's a lot easier and less of a problem than a fully closed helmet like an armored. And a similar situation you could say about your Brigandine, although again, this was used in action, so you can still say, hey, I just like the Brigandine. I like the way it feels. So overall, I love the Brigandine. I think it's a fantastic piece. And by the way, if you noticed, sometimes you can see a little bit of the plates here. And that's not because the Brigandine is not well tailored for me, but it's simply because I need to add one more hole here, because as you can see, the moment I make it a little tighter, then it fits perfectly. So I just need to add one hole in the strap, in the leather strap, and it will be perfect. But in general, do I love the Brigandine? Absolutely. Do you? What do you think about my Brigandine? Do you like it, and what sort of combination would have you gone for? Would you have worn a Brigandine? Would you have gone for a more protective full plate harness? Would you go for the Brigandine shoulders like Shad, or would you rather go for full plate shoulders and limbs and just keep the Brigandine for your torso? Well, let me know in the comments below. I'm really curious to know. Now, I promised I would have spoken a little bit about the points. Now, for those who don't know, full plate arms, full plate legs and shoulders need to be pointed, which means you need to use these strips. In this case, this is made of linen. It has been covered in beeswax like historical examples, and has a tip made of brass because I just like brass. And these are used to suspend the armor. That's the only way you can actually wear full plate legs, arms and shoulders. You need to either point them to your arming doublet, like in my case, and again we see very similar kinds of points in iconography, or you can point them directly to your mail. Whatever the case, these are very well made. They were made by a lovely lady in Wales, and I will leave a link in the description for you to check her out and perhaps order yours. They're very sturdy, very nice and very stylish. What about these lovely shoulder plates here? Well, these are placeholders, just like the leg harness that you see me wear on the video, and that is because my actual full plate arms with shoulders asymmetrical, they are being sent to me. They're being produced, but they're being sent. I'm still waiting because of COVID, of course, and so I decided to just put on these, which are more of a German style, and so they're a little anachronistic with my kit because I am recreating a more of an Italian impression, but they're still fine. I mean, at the end of the day, it's not like only Germans wore German armor, and it's not like only Italians wore Italian armor. But again, a little bit of a mismatch, these, I do have to say, but I'm just wearing them to show you how plate shoulder defense looks together with the Brigandine. And the reason I'm doing this is because I wanted to show you a different approach to what Shad chose, which is still absolutely legitimate. I mean, Shad decided to go for the full Brigandine look, and that's absolutely fine. I think it looks very sexy on the man. Love you, Shad. So the sort of look that I'm going for when my actual shoulder defense is made of plate and my full plate arms will arrive is more typical of a medieval soldier wearing a Brigandine. By the way, links to all of these great videos about the Brigandine, both from Schola Gladiatoria and Shadiversity, in the comments. But then again, the question comes, I mean, I do have a male shirt, why the heck am I not wearing this one underneath? And the reason is, it's going to be a bit silly maybe, but this shirt is coated in grease and oil, which, to be honest, I'd like to say, I mean, this was given to me as a gift, so I'm really grateful for it. Thank you so much, Gabriel, for this, but maybe next time if you want to send me anything made of mail, please don't oil it. You don't really need it. As long as you wear it and you use it, mail is self-cleaning anyways, and I don't really want to wear oily shirt on top of this very nice arming doublet, but I am having a second doublet produced that is going to be a lot less qualitatively present, if you will, and therefore I won't care. I will wear it on top of that one, but on this one, absolutely not. But then again, as I say, it is still historically accurate and it's fine.
Right, on the next segment, we're going to look at the equipment of a common soldier. Well, a successful one, because the Brigandine would be expensive. But the rest of it, let's complete the set. Hey number ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking. Oftentimes we see medieval soldiers. We see them all the time in video games, in movies. And the idea of a medieval soldier's kit and how much of an encumbrance would be is really a question that has been permeating my thoughts for, I don't know, 2 decades,
Now, I so happen to have a full medieval soldier's kit right behind me, and this is a very historically accurate and coherent set. So I think that this is a great opportunity to start answering this question. How much encumbrance would a full medieval soldier's kit have? How heavy was a medieval soldier? How much would it slow you down? And of course, we're not only going to focus on combat, because usually people just think about combat, but it's interesting to think that combat is really not the only thing that a soldier does. In fact, it's probably one of the least things a soldier happens to do. His daily routine most of the time is not going to involve combat, but it's going to involve a lot of other things. How tough would it be to wear a real, historically accurate medieval set? Well, let's have a look at the set, and I'll answer that question for you. Of course, the Middle Ages are a very long period of time. We're talking about over 1,000 years, depending on how you count it. So in this case, we need to choose a specific century, and I decided to go for a 15th century soldier. I've got quite a lot of options in terms of my offense. So I've got 3 different maces and an arming sword, so a one-handed sword. And as far as my soft kit is concerned, I've got the typical medieval hose, I've got leather shoes, and my arming doublet, which is a reinforced garment that you use to attach elements of armor. In fact, it's got all the points, which are these linen threads with brass caps that are used, in fact, to attach elements of armor, such as your full plate leg harness, full plate arms, shoulder plates. In terms of my helmet is concerned, I picked a very typical kettle hat. Usually when people think of a kettle hat, they usually think of the one that actually looks like an iron hat. The one I'm having here is a late 15th century typical Italian style, and from this kind of helmet you will have the further development in the future of the sallet, which is very similar if you think about it, particularly if you look at it from the back. Now, as far as torso protection, I've got my mail shirt, regular riveted steel rings, short sleeved, regular length of the time. It also goes all the way down, protecting my groin. I've got a male standard, which is the protection, or the collar protection for my throat. And then on top of that, I've got my Brigandine, which people who are familiar with this channel already know. I've got dedicated videos, so I won't go too much into the details of this, but it's a very well made Brigandine made of many different hardened steel plates, fully tinned and riveted to a hand spun silk velvet outside garment through 2,000 brass rivets. So what kind of medieval soldier do we have here? Well, it's a well-equipped soldier. Now, given, I'm sure that the first thing you're noticing, I've got no protection for my arms and no protection for my legs. So is this like a light kit? Well, I wouldn't really call it a light kit because I've got 2 layers of protection on my torso. I would rather call it a more of a medium kind of soldier's kit, if you will. Some medieval soldiers did choose to go all the way to full plate protection for their limbs, but not all did, and we see this backed up with evidence. Iconography shows that some soldiers just had a spear, a shield, a helmet, and that was that. We're just wearing then their arming doublets and their hose and then regular shoes. And it seems like that the next element of protection that you do buy after you've got a helmet and you've got your weapon and your shield is your torso protection. And if you can't afford it, you just leave your limbs unprotected, and perhaps some people even chose to do so. So this set is coherent. I've got good protection for my torso. Perhaps at the moment I'm a soldier who has gone through a few battles, has earned some money, has survived. He could buy a good Brigandine. He has definitely got a thing for maces. I mean, that's quite clear. And let's try and put all of this on, and let's see how much it slows me down as I go on with my day as a medieval soldier. Let's go for it. So am I armed well enough to perform as a functioning soldier on a medieval battlefield? And the answer is that as we said, my armoring up is fine, but my weapons, I'm lacking, because I've got quite a good selection of maces. I've got a very good sword. I do need a proper scabbard to be made for that sword, which I still don't have. But most importantly, what I need is a pole weapon. I need a pole arm to properly function as a medieval soldier, and that's something that I'm still lacking, and eventually I will get one, possibly a couple maybe, prepared properly for me, so I can take them to perhaps even a medieval town or a medieval castle. We've got quite plenty here in Sicily, and in Italy, never mind, it's like countless. And I could, make some really good footage, so look forward to that. But what about shields? Shouldn't I be using shields? And if the answer is yes, then what sort of shields should I be carrying? And the answer to that can actually depend, because it really depends what specific century and what specific date I'm trying to reenact. And as a content creator on this platform, yes, I will get quite a few shields. I will get a rotella, which is the circular shield used in medieval reality. I will get obviously a few heater shields. I'm hoping to get a pavese, which is like the massive shield you normally use as a stationary shield to protect crossbowmen, because I would love to fully reenact also a Genoese crossbowman of the late Middle Ages. That would be fantastic. So yeah, I will be looking into a whole range of shields to use and perhaps compare. But the moment I specifically decide to reenact a soldier with a specific kit in mind, like for example, this is clearly mid to late 15th century. So as we pass 1450, 1460, then if the impression I'm recreating, or you are recreating, is an Italian impression, then shields such as heater shields start to become not very used very much in Italy. But if you are recreating an impression of, say, a 1450s man-at-arms in France or Germany, no problem, heater shields were still used. If we go to Luxembourg, then I can easily find a piece of evidence such as this one, a piece of iconography. This is dated 1453, and still heater shields are used. So heater shields were used also into the mid and sometimes even late 15th century in Europe, but depending on what specific country you are reenacting, then it might be appropriate or not, or you might need to select a different kind of shield. But for me as a content creator, because I like discussing all of these things, then I definitely will pick up perhaps shields that wouldn't be specific for the Italian impression, but it won't matter, because of course I'll give you caveats to that. But at the moment, what I'm wearing, it can be used really for many different impressions. I mean, brigandines were used in quite a few countries in Europe. Now, given some countries do present a lot less evidence for brigandines than others, and when we look at, for example, the brigandine shoulders, the spolders, then those as well, they're even less common, and it's more common to see instead full plate shoulder plates. Now, they do exist, but then again, depending on what specific country you're trying to reenact and what impression you're trying to build, then that might dictate the sort of repertoire that you've got available to choose from. And that's the same for helmets and whatnot. Now, that's not to say that if you are reenacting a noble knight, so mounted nobility, so you're a wealthy man, you're rich, and perhaps you have seen people let's say that you're reenacting an Italian knight, but you have seen people using specific kinds of helmets or specific kinds of weapons and armor or armor configurations that you like. Nobody stops you from getting that stuff, whether it be for personal collection or whether it be for actually carrying on the battlefield. There will be exceptions. Now, from a reenactment point of view, we shouldn't really reenact exceptions too much, because if you do, then they become the norm, and there will be a big difference in the way the Middle Ages are represented on a reenactment level and the way the Middle Ages were in reality. And so you will have a very different look, because everybody's wearing the same kind of very obscure helmet that perhaps only, I don't know, a handful of people used in the medieval period, but everybody likes it now, and so it has become a ubiquitous helmet. So that can happen. Generally speaking, I want to say I can tell that there is a relative big difference between wearing a mail shirt alone with the entirety of the rest of the kit and wearing a Brigandine on top of that. There is a difference, but in terms of how I can move, as you could see, my mobility is almost the same. Now, given you might have noticed that there is some range of motion that I kind of lose or perhaps becomes a bit awkward when it comes to raising my arms all the way up here, but that's because of my arming doublet. It's not because of my Brigandine, and therefore it's not because of my mail. It's not the armor part that is really doing that, restricting me, but it's the soft kit, although this might sound counterintuitive. Even wearing all of my kit together, including the Brigandine on top of the mail shirt, because of the fact that my Brigandine is well shaped and it tapers at the waist, therefore distributing the weight very well on my body and basically almost non-existing weight on my shoulders because it's all in the center of my body, my waist, the natural waist, then it does add to the overall weight I'm wearing, but still, this kind of set, I wouldn't consider it heavy at all. I can easily wear all of this all day, and it's actually easier for me to wear than a lorica segmentata of the Roman imperial period. And when I say that, please keep in mind, for those of you who don't know, that I do have a video where I show myself testing out the lorica segmentata of the Romans to the point of wearing it every day, all day, for 14 days in a row. So I know what I'm talking about when I talk about comfort and discomfort of the lorica segmentata, and when I compare it to this is a piece of cake. Now that's interesting because what I'm wearing is a double layer protection, whereas a segmentata is a single layer protection. But the thing is that it's a matter of shape. You wouldn't believe how much a properly shaped armor takes away much of the encumbrance from you. It is unbelievable. Now, given with a lorica segmentata, you also have shoulder protection that are integrated into the set. With this, I need to add it. So, for example, I've got these. The reason why I'm not wearing them is because they are slightly anachronistic and they're generally speaking German in their shape. That's what I have. I usually use them for sparring, but my Italian set is also arriving. It was sent to me, the rest of my arm harness and shoulder plates, and so I might actually do some tests. But so I am a little lighter compared to a Roman when it comes to my shoulders, but even if I added the shoulders, because of the fact that they are pointed, and they can be pointed either to mail or directly to my arming doublet, it's really up to you. There are lots of, you can even point them to the leather straps, really. This was done as well. So the reason, because of the fact that they are pointed, and because of the system in which they are suspended, suspension really helps. And the lorica segmentata as a design really focuses on the fact that, yeah, it's uncomfortable because most of the shoulder weight, because the shoulder plates will be on your shoulders. I mean, the body of a lorica segmentata, when it's properly shaped, it's okay. You don't really feel it that much. Then you put on your cingulum militaris nice and tight, the military belt, and then that's okay. But the shoulders will be on your shoulders, and given you can wear a thoracomachus or a subarmalis underneath, which is a padded garment that most likely they did wear, because it is mentioned in Latin literature, although of course we don't have surviving examples, because it being organic material, it deteriorated from the classical period. Regardless of that, the lorica segmentata, very much of it is on your shoulders, but this, even if you add other pieces, it's all going to be suspended. So this is one of the areas in which we see a drastic technological development and improvement in the medieval period, of course late medieval period in this case, as opposed to the 1st century. Yes, all armor is made of metal, although it's not exactly the same kind of metal. Perhaps I'll make a dedicated video to that. But the way the armor is worn really makes a significant difference. So, how encumbered am I as a medieval soldier? Not that much. I can do a lot of things. Now, given it's not as easy to do, things are not as easy to do, and tasks and chores are not as easy to perform, and guard duty and whatnot, as they would be if I wasn't wearing armor. But of course, wearing armor, that's just how it is. It's a compromise. I mean, you're getting a lot of protection, which you do need and you do want as a soldier. And I have to say that the compromise is more than acceptable. So if you have a late medieval soldier in your book, in your D&D session, or just a movie, and you want to know how encumbered would regular medieval soldier be in his kit, well, I want to say not very much. You can really do a lot of things. You would be someone who does it on a regular basis, at least on campaign, when called on campaigns. And if you're a professional man-at-arms, you would do it all the time. So I would imagine it would be even easier for them than it would be for me.
Oh, this one drives me nuts. I can already feel my diluted pizza blood boiling. Sometimes I feel as if the medieval period is one of the most misunderstood period of all. Oftentimes movies and sometimes video games, all of this sort of entertainment industry really misrepresents the medieval period. Preach it, my liege! The other day I was talking to my friend Martin, who really inspired me to make this rant, but I'll try to keep calm. I had pasta. Because whenever on this channel I talk about medieval knights or samurai or the ancient Roman soldiers, no problem. Everybody considers samurai to be like, wow, a samurai, oh yes, very highly trained, you know, you don't want to mess with a samurai. And now people finally understood that, you know, the medieval knight was not just a clanking tin can that couldn't move. Luckily we debunked that one. And when it comes to the ancient Romans, of course, apart from some people that say that ancient Rome doesn't exist, I would say that 99.9% of the population will agree that when you talk about a Roman soldier, you're talking about a professional soldier. But medieval soldiers, oh my goodness, if you don't believe me, if you think, oh, you're just building a strawman, yeah, a strawman, I'll show you a strawman, just go check, just type, just Google it, Metatron, medieval soldier, and check the comments. The classic person that says, oh, but medieval soldiers, they're nothing, peasants with a pitchfork. Of course, on a battlefield you will see the difference between a medieval knight who's been training since he was frigging 7 and someone who's just been levied, although, you know, medieval campaigns could be very long, and I would imagine after a few battles and some battle experience you could consider some of these soldiers, even though they're not soldiers by profession necessarily, you know, whenever the campaign is over they just go back to their manual labor in the farm, they would still be button hardened. I think people really don't give enough credit to the physicality of not only farm hands but also, you know, stable boys or anyone who was working the fields, who worked physically. They walked everywhere because they couldn't afford horses, woke up in the morning, went to the fields, used to operating all sorts of tools that they were using on a daily basis. These are people that are used to a very manual kind of labor. These would have been strong men, so whenever people say, oh, just a bunch of peasants, well, you know, I wouldn't want to fight one of those peasants. Particularly after you give him a helmet and a spear instead of a frigging pitchfork. I mean, the pitchfork. Oh, but how could they be strong men? We're talking about medieval peasants. The population was not well fed. Only the noblemen were well fed. Population, they were just eating slop or gruel, disgusting gruel. If that's what you've been told, you really need to go subscribe to Modern History TV, where my dear friend Jason Kingsley made 2 fantastic videos about medieval cuisine, where he talks about what a medieval peasant eats. And on this video, even though it's not a dedicated video to medieval cuisine, which I am producing, I will mention all of the different kinds of foods that were available to the medieval common man. But one thing I'm gonna say now, medieval farmers and peasants were very well fed, and that includes proteins. More on that later, to quote Lindy Beige. The third section of this video is probably going to be the most fun, because I'm going to talk about the way these people would fight. We're going to play around a little bit with my maces and with my newly acquired buckler, so definitely stick to the end of the video. So that was a little bit of a bold statement. What do I mean by medieval peasants were generally speaking very well fed? When people work the land, they need energy, and in order to get that energy they need to eat well. So this should really be common sense. And when it comes to availability of food, yes, there were some foods that only the noble could afford. Say, for example, sugar, particularly towards the beginning of the Middle Ages all the way up to, I want to say, 1500s. Sugar was very expensive, so much so that it was considered a spice and was sometimes just sprinkled over stuff. When it comes to meat, the situation is very varied. Yes, expensive cuts of game for the nobles, chicken, generally speaking, for the nobles, but a lot of farmers had pigs, and they would slaughter these pigs in winter and just make bacon and eat that. Sausages. And let's not forget fish as a form of protein. Salmon was readily available. Just go to the river and catch it, as Jason Kingsley eloquently pointed out in his video, together with his lovely guest. But cod, carp, these would be available. Now, pike as a fish for the aristocracy, although again, I'm kind of speaking very broadly here, and that's why I say I will make a dedicated video, because it really depends where in Europe we are talking about. For example, olive oil was a lot more common in southern Europe, particularly in Italy, whereas in the northern countries in Europe they would rather use butter, for example, for frying. Milk was drank by the common people, whereas usually aristocracy would use it to cook it rather than directly drink it. And again, the upper class could also choose non-dairy products such as almond milk. Bread has been around forever. There is, of course, a difference in the way, for example, the ancient Romans produced bread and medieval people produced bread. Milling, leavening, and baking went through various stages of development over the centuries. In Roman times, water power was already used to grind flour, and by AD 1000, windmills began to appear. Very Age of Empires reminiscent, if you will. I freaking love that game. There were professional bakers even in ancient Egypt all the way back to 2000 BC. Bread was easily available. White bread would be for the aristocracy, whereas brown bread and wholemeal bread would be more for the poor. Interestingly enough. Of course, the difference between the bread used by the lower classes and the upper classes didn't only have to do with the fact that it was brown bread versus white bread, it's also the fact that the white bread used for the upper class would come from finest wheats. Still, the sort of white bread used by the medieval upper class would not be exactly like the white bread that we consume today, as at least it still contained the wheat germ that is normally removed from our modern white bread. Anyways, the coarser, the darker the bread, the lower class you were. But still, you had access to bread, and that's carbs. Beet was a staple of the lower classes. Lots of different kinds of kale were used. Of course, if you go to Italy instead, broccoli and cauliflower would be more used. And yet legumes of all kinds were eaten by the lower classes. And that's a lot of proteins for you there. Medieval society is complex. Clearly, in a situation of famine, that would be different. But there wasn't always a famine in Europe. And in fact, even after the terrible Black Plague or the spread of the infectious disease caused by the Yersinia pestis bacterium at the end of the 1300s, there was more free land, there wasn't too much space, there was less competition for space, you could ask for more money because there was a demand for new working hands. A medieval peasant won't be able to afford rabbit or hare meat. That would be too expensive, but they could still be well fed. Now let's talk about the man at arms. People think that a man at arms is just, again, a peasant that has been drafted. Give him a helmet, give him a broken shield, send him to the field, just a grunt that is gonna get killed, he doesn't know what he's doing. And this image has been popularized also by games that I love. Britannia for Warhammer Fantasy. For those of you who are my age, you know what I'm talking about. I'm gonna show you what men at arms are in a Bretonnian army, and then we can talk about what they actually were in the medieval period. For the Bretonnians, they're exactly described as that. They are peasants just mashed together. A medieval men-at-arms were men that fought in the manner of the knight. And a lot of the knights that we see in the medieval iconography are actually men-at-arms, as it's explained by Dr. Tobias Capwell in his book. Some men-at-arms were wearing full plate armor. But even if we just talk about levied infantry, yes, the average levied, drafted medieval soldier is not going to be as trained as an ancient Roman professional soldier. But there are exceptions to this. Say, for example, late medieval pikemen, extremely highly disciplined troops. You had medieval mercenary soldiers, and again, like for example the Genoese crossbowmen, very specialized kinds of troops. And if we really want to make it wide, what about archers, like the English longbowmen, working in a village, and yet they were extremely highly trained in the usage of the bow because it was mandatory by law in Britain, also because it takes years to train archers in the proper usage of a war bow. And ultimately you've got the Italian condottieri, another kind of medieval mercenary force with troops that will have been trained to a certain degree. Not as trained as the ancient Romans. We'll have to wait to the early modern period to reach that kind of level of professionalism, but that doesn't mean that medieval troops were a bunch of idiots that didn't know what they were doing. When it comes to the way medieval infantry fought, this is my opinion, and I would love to hear what Matt Easton has to say, for example, on this, since he knows a lot more than I do on this kind of topic. But my opinion is, if you compare the way a regular medieval levied soldier were to fight, then it's never going to be as sophisticated as the sort of medieval fighting treatises that we know are associated with the upper class and aristocracy. But then again, when we're talking about melee, when we're talking about battlefield warfare and combat, not all of your soldiers need to be extremely highly trained duelists in order for you to win. Numbers are extremely important, luck is important, the weather conditions, who is attacking, who is defending, a surprise factor, how skilled the commander is, of course weapons and armor, army distribution, mounted troops, infantry, cavalry, ranged, people being outsmarted because of tactics, strategy, money, general morale. As long as you make sure that your soldiers can work as a cohesive unit, at the end of the day, block, riposte, don't run away, I think that's gonna be enough. In the movies we see a lot of running and charging of infantry, but in reality I want to say most battles were formation slowly advancing and then trying to overcome each other.
Hello noble ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and today we're going to compare two very interesting kinds of body armor, namely the Roman lorica segmentata, generally speaking used by Roman heavy infantry between the 1st century BC all the way up to the mid 3rd century AD, so for about 3 centuries. And this late medieval, to be specific late 15th century Brigandine, used by both medieval common soldiers and sometimes nobility. The two kinds of armor that we're going to examine today might look relatively similar. I mean, at the end of the day, they're both made of multiple plates of steel. They are both put on in a way similar to a jacket, and they were both used to protect you on the field from arrows, from spears, from swords. Now, on this video, we're going to get practical. I'm going to put on both armors. I'm going to use them. I'm going to do general mobility, and then we're going to discuss the protection, overall aesthetics, the pros and cons of both armors. But before doing that, I'd like you to, for a moment, focus on one thing, and that is the difference, the temporal difference between the two. To be specific, 1,500 years of difference. Now, from our perspective as modern people from 2021, they both look like ancient tech. They are both ancient kinds of armor. And yet, even from the perspective of a medieval soldier who was living in the late 1400s, the lorica segmentata that was used in the 1st century AD, so 1,500 years before that, would have looked ancient as well. I need my silly hat. Seriously, think about it. If we go back 1,500 years from this very moment in time, we are in the 5th century. So Rome fell, then you've got the early Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages, the Late Middle Ages, then you've got the Renaissance, the early industrial period, then you've got the pre-modern era, the modern times. All of these things that I've just said happened over 1,500 years. Now, starting from the medieval period, taking that exact amount of time, you will go back to the times when that Roman sort of armor was used. It's the exact same difference. Now, of course, the technological development that we have experienced in the last couple of centuries is more impressive than the sort of technological difference that there is between an ancient Roman and a medieval person. Technological development is not linear in its progression, but it develops exponentially in a sort of curvature, so that needs to be kept in mind, but still, that's the time difference between these two kinds of armor. Now let's try them on. So, after all of this testing, I'd like to say that yes, I definitely prefer the Brigandine. I think it is a better design. I can see that the sort of technological gap between what the Romans could do, which was already exceptional in their time, and what medieval people could do, particularly in the later part of the medieval period. Still, you can tell that there is a reasonable technological gap between the two once you actually wear them, and I have to say that if I had to choose between wearing my Brigandine for 4 days or wearing my lorica segmentata for 2 days, I would definitely choose the Brigandine, even if I wasn't going to go into actual combat, simply because it's a lot easier to wear, it's a lot easier to put on and to take off, and at the end of the day, it's just a more comfortable armor. We know that there are many different features that characterize armor as it's being developed, and yet among all of these different features, when talking about battlefield armor, stealth isn't one of them. But can you be stealthy as you're wearing battlefield armor if you need to? Hello noble ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and the question today is particularly interesting because it covers all sorts of different fields. Understanding if you can be stealthy in armor or not is interesting as we study these objects within their historical period environment. So if you're passionate for armor, you're an historian, you're an archaeologist, this can help you understand these objects better. But it is also interesting when it comes to video game mechanics, or even D&D, as the Player's Handbook has a whole chapter that talks just about that. Which kinds of armor even allow you to be stealthy and which ones give you a disadvantage? Well, on this channel we're all about practice, so we're going to put on lots of different kinds of armor and we're going to test it. Late 15th century Italian full plate armor, late 15th century Brigandine, 16th century samurai armor, 14th century and 15th century breastplates only, mail armor, also known in games as chainmail. So make sure to watch until the end because we're going to do a lot of different tests. We're going to start by analyzing the sort of actions that you would need to be able to do if you tried to be stealthy while wearing all of these kinds of armor. Walking, running, jogging, jumping, crouching, opening doors, moving all your limbs around, and fighting. After having estimated the amount of noise that all of these different kinds of armor produced as you're doing these actions, we're going to try and see solutions in order to make the armor more silent. Okay, when it comes to running, plate is extremely loud, you can hear it a mile away. Samurai armor was also quite loud. Brigandine, you can barely hear it, only occasionally when the plates articulate, that's when it makes a noise. Mail, the rings make a recognizable noise that you can hear, but it's not very loud. And the breastplate made virtually no sound at all. And any sound you hear is most likely from our equipment. But then again, even with regular shoes, running will produce a noise. So when it comes to stealth, walking is where the situation will probably amaze you with the results we've found. We're gonna have two kinds of walking, a regular walk when we don't care, and a stealthy walk. Check this out and tell me if it's not a surprise. So what really amazed me when it comes to walking is that you can be stealthy even in plate armor. Although in the case of plate, I noticed that I should try and keep my arms elevated and already bent, because if I bend them, then the full plate arms will make a noise. So if I want to try and stab someone or operate any sort of machinery or lever, I should bend my arms very, very slowly and then I can proceed. But in general, as you could see, with all sorts of armor, we could be stealthy while walking. It was not a problem. If you notice that we didn't go for stealthy walk with Brigandine and breastplate, is because already the regular walk didn't produce any sound anyways, so there was no point. For comparison, here is the sound these armors make when you jump.
And when it comes to moving around your arms, well, if you're fighting and you're wearing armor, it's going to be very difficult to be silent. In fact, when it comes to fighting, it's only the breastplate alone that allows you to basically move and do whatever you want and have no problems because you have no noise. And that's interesting because it matches D&D. The D&D system telling us that when you're wearing a breastplate, you don't have a disadvantage, and that is spot on. So we know that with all sorts of armor, you can walk stealthily and reach a target. But the moment you strike, some sets will make a sound, others won't. Check this out. So as you could see, I want to say breastplate, Brigandine, no problem even if there were other enemies around, while the others do make a noise. So after eliminating the first target, then if there are other targets around, then your presence would be known. See a similar situation here with full plate. I'm just going to try full plate because all the other kinds of armor, I'm not going to have a problem opening a door. With full plate arms, I just need to be extremely careful and again have my arms bent, possibly before entering the critical zone where people could hear me. In both samurai armor and full plate armor, we have noticed that the shoulders are, or pauldrons or sode for the samurai version, are where a lot of the noise comes from, particularly when you move around your arms. So if you really want to be as stealthy as possible while still maintaining a certain level of protection, then removing pauldrons and sode could be a good idea. Because when we look at it from a video game point of view, usually in games such as, I don't know, the Elder Scrolls, the noise you produce is actually linked to your boots. I don't know if you knew that. Remove the boots and see what you'll sound like. In a way, this is kind of similar with actual armor. It's not the entire set that makes a noise, it's the touching and overlapping of specific parts of the set. So if we can isolate those parts, we can understand what's making a noise, and then we can find a solution in order to reduce that noise. So what we have learned today is that a highly articulated and highly segmented kind of chest protector, such as the Brigandine, but I want to say scale armor probably, do make a little bit of noise in certain extreme movement situations, but otherwise they're okay. And generally speaking, protection of your chest isn't the problem. Full plate breastplate, samurai breastplate, they don't make a noise. Shoulder protectors such as pauldrons and sode and the fold and generally speaking lower part of the armor do make most of the noise as they move around and hit each other. And then limb protection. Now of course we have just tested full plate arms on me, but as you can see, this full plate leg that unfortunately is too big for me to wear, but I can show you the articulation is what makes the sound. Therefore, if you can try and walk with the leg kept as straight as possible, you will reduce the noise a lot. So anything that has to do with limb protection can be controlled by you. So the solution for pauldrons and the lower sector, so the fold, would be either to remove them or to cover them in leather or any kind of fabric. That would dramatically reduce the noise, and interestingly enough, historically it was done, probably for fashion and personal preference. Why didn't they do it very often? Because they didn't care. This is battlefield armor. But in a context where we want to know, could you solve this problem if you needed to? Yes, you could. The figure of the knight is certainly one of the most iconic of the medieval era, shrouded in a sort of charm that still persists to this day both in literature and cinema. It should be noted that the medieval knight emerges with all the characteristics that make him familiar to us, following a long process which blends different elements and types of warriors, characterized by both practical and military aspects as well as economic and social ones. Owning a horse with the possibility of using it as a mount in battle was a prerogative of wealthy social classes already in ancient times, including classical antiquity. That is because maintaining an animal that, unlike cattle, pigs and goats, did not have yields in terms of food production was a significant expense. Historically, in Europe, the first to be defined as knights, at least if we want to find a sort of counterpart in Latin, would be the equites, who were members of the bourgeoisie of Republican Rome. These were citizens who did not belong to the noble class, but who had enough money to spend on maintaining a horse with which to go into battle, an element that became distinctive and characterizing. Despite essentially being the rich, or rather the enriched, the term that defines in fact them as a social class is precisely equites, which in English would be translated as horsemen. From a purely functional perspective, it should be noted that cavalry did not play a predominant role in ancient armies. Just like light infantry, cavalry served as support for heavy infantry, which was at this time the true queen of the battlefield. Skillful use of cavalry certainly enabled victories in battles, as demonstrated by strategists such as Alexander the Great and Hannibal, but only when it was employed, like other specialized units such as archers, slingers, skirmishers, in support of rank-and-file infantry. In other words, shock cavalry or heavy cavalry charges are a later development, and we'll get there. So, how did cavalry work exactly in the classical period? Well, very often Western cavalry forces until the 1st century BC behaved as reconnaissance troops, attacking enemies on the flanks or from behind, used to pursue a routing enemy, or were tasked with engaging other cavalry forces, avoiding direct confrontation with heavy infantry and preferring to harass them with javelins, or even acting as mounted infantry who would dismount to fight in battle. An exception to this would be the cavalry of the Macedonian world, whose frontal charges with a long two-handed lance, which were possible precisely because they were executed strategically in concert with the maneuvers of the phalanx infantry. Perhaps not coincidentally, from an ideological perspective, the hetairoi, Alexander the Great's mounted companions, would become one of the inspirational models for the knight of the late Middle Ages. Cavalry started to gain prestige and increase its tactical significance during the Imperial Age because of the invention of the horned saddle, a Gallic model that significantly increased the rider's stability. This is also reflected in Roman art, where the stylistic element of the barbarian being trampled by the horseman becomes a particularly widespread iconography. There were, however, other factors that also contributed to the growing prestige of cavalry as a prominent element on the battlefields throughout the Imperial Age, such as the increasingly frequent recruitment into Roman armies of elements from Eastern Germanic populations, such as the Goths and the Indo-Iranian peoples, the Sarmatians, who were accustomed to fighting on horseback, but also the need to act swiftly along the entire frontier of the limes, or limes, to contain barbarian attacks, in a form of conflict that made mobility and speed essential and invaluable elements. There is, however, another element that must be discussed when talking about cavalry in the Roman period, and that is the adoption of a heavy cavalry model inspired by the Persian world, so-called cataphracts, a word of Greek origins that the Romans would have called in Latin clibanari. These could be considered to some extent the ancestors of heavy cavalry of the Middle Ages. In the transition between late antiquity and the early Middle Ages, due to the civil changes taking place in Europe that saw the dismantling of some of the previous structures of the classical world and the re-emergence of social relationship imbalances with an archaic flavor still present in the Germanic world, the figure of the mounted warrior increasingly coincided with the private militia and personal guard of this or that illustrious personality, and the first to fit this description properly were those called bucellari, literally biscuit eaters, named after the bucellatum, the soldier's bread, or hardtack. These were fighters equipped and paid by a noble or a high official to act as their retinue, and, if numbers allowed, even as a personal army, who usually enjoyed superior training. As we continue our journey through the ages, exploring the beginnings and evolutions of the figure of the knight, we could say that the bucellari are conceptually the foundation for the subsequent mounted fighting units that would establish themselves under the Carolingian world. These knights, who were effectively close to monarchs and nobles thanks to the royal gifts of land holdings called benefices, which they would receive in exchange for their service, eventually became nobility themselves when the Frankish king, Charles the Bald, made these lands hereditary by decree. We could say that by definition, being part of a monarch's or high-ranking noble's retinue, as well as fighting on horseback, are the two elements that would characterize knights in their definition during the early Middle Ages. Now let's have a look at the word knight and its etymology. The Anglo-Saxon world would use the word Knecht to define what was both a new social class and a military corps, while the German world would use Knecht, from which modern English knight derives. Knecht becomes Knecht, Kneicht, Kneit, knight. The original Germanic root has several meanings, from young man, boy, to servant, but should be understood in this latter meaning: someone who serves, who is subordinate, who is bound to someone else, namely the king or a noble. Curiously, we find the term in the name of another type of fighter between the late Middle Ages and the Renaissance, the Landsknecht. Land, Knecht, one who serves the land. The French-speaking world would instead use the word chevalier, from cheval, horse, and in Germany Knecht would gradually be abandoned during the late Middle Ages for the form Ritter, person who rides, a rider. The increasingly widespread use of mounted regiments as no longer a support element but as a keystone of armies, and the establishment of a nobility born from the equestrian military sphere led to a selection of animals, which probably already begun in late Roman times, that produced substantial changes in horse sizes. While ancient horses were essentially little larger than ponies, standing between 1.10 m and 1.30 m, targeted crossbreeding with breeds from the east led to the birth of increasingly large and imposing beasts, making the knight much more formidable both from a practical and psychological point of view. And from a functional perspective, the introduction of the stirrup, probably arriving in Europe with a Mongol origin between the 6th and the 7th century AD, which was adopted by the Franks around the 8th century, must have further contributed to the establishment of the knight as a model warrior, a shock impact factor, although contemporary military historians largely agree that its contribution has been exaggerated by historical literature of the 1960s. It is in fact possible that while the stirrup undoubtedly made horseback riding easier, its use, at least during the early Middle Ages, must not have been as revolutionary as the invention of the horned saddle that we discussed earlier when it comes to the ancient times. At least according to the sources, its primary function seems to have been not so much to maintain stability, but to mount the horse easily, as evidenced by its Latin name, transcribed in Greek characters in the strategikon scala, which means ladder. Yes, the ancients called it a ladder. Now, if we want to look for a specific battle that kind of marks the moment in which cavalry becomes more important in Europe as a main component within military strategy, of course we could think and go all the way back to the Battle of Adrianople, but I think the most fitting example would be indeed the famous Battle of Hastings of 1066. That is because if we look at the Bayeux tapestry, however it's pronounced, when we look at the Saxons and the Normans, sometimes they're almost virtually indistinguishable, and the one thing that sets aside the victorious Normans over the Saxons is the fact that a huge chunk of their troops is in fact mounted. They focus on cavalry. But as we continue our journey deeper within the medieval period, that's when a specific type of technique called la lance couchée, or the idea of putting your lance underneath your armpit, and a stronger focus on impact cavalry will make use, a good 250 years later, of the invention of the stirrup, maximizing its potential. And as we continue into the late Middle Ages with the advent of plate armor, the lance in rest will further strengthen and solidify this fighting technique, maximizing the impact force on the target. As we discuss all of this, one thing that we have to discuss is how effective cavalry charges are against infantry. What's important to say is that cavalry doesn't always trump infantry, and it is in fact a matter of training. With that being said, it is absolutely true that at least until the late 13th century, infantry formations that would be disciplined enough to remain compact in the face of a heavy cavalry charge rarely existed, due to several factors that also involved the psychological sphere. Since the time of the Bucellari, the mounted warrior was well trained. First, because the noble took care of his sustenance, then because he became noble himself, while infantry units of the early medieval period were increasingly made up of poorly armed and unmotivated conscripts. A massive shift when you think about it when compared to the Roman era, particularly when it comes to very professional and heavily armed infantry units, the citizen infantry. we will not see that level of professionalism all the way up to the modern period. This is a phenomenon that established itself at different times in different areas, but beyond some notable exceptions, usually relating to Northern Europe, see for example the Saxon Huscarls at Hastings, who were infantry but simultaneously elite troops from a high social class, we can increasingly consider it a norm for a fair portion of the Middle Ages. On the contrary, knights were better trained, also because that's what they did. It was their profession. At the same time, they didn't have to go farm the land. They had a lot of time to focus on training, which sculpted their physiques, increased their martial prowess, their effectiveness. Not to mention that due to the fact that they were low nobility, usually a knight would be wealthy, which means he can be better armed, with more effective equipment, which would be, of course, costly and protective. On top of that, being noble meant that they ate better. Nutrition is also an important aspect of the effectiveness of a soldier in battle. They consumed more meat more often, they were therefore on average taller and more robust. A single knight must have appeared on the battlefield as a sort of invincible tank, impervious to blows, and at the same time, deadly. If you're enjoying this video so far, please take a moment to check out my Patreon page. With as little as a $5 support, you can help us ensure that we can continue to produce high quality and high researched content. And at the same time, you get access to polls, extra videos, unlisted streams, and much more. Thank you so much. The conviction of belonging to a superior social class, if not a superior lineage, is typical of the medieval knights of this era, as this concept develops alongside the birth of chivalric orders that are nothing more than the medieval revival of the warbands of noble warriors from ancient times and the early Middle Ages. Knights were, to some extent, conscious of this element, and it is no coincidence that chivalric narratives refer back to Alexander the Great's companions, the mythical knights of King Arthur and the Round Table, and, of course, Charlemagne's paladins. It is, however, also important to underline that oftentimes when we say men-at-arms, even though we imagine, once again, low-level, low-tier, improvised infantry units that are poor and can just pick up a couple of spears, maybe there is a billman, maybe a helmet, perhaps a piece of mail underneath or on top of their gambeson. Some men-at-arms actually fought in the manner of the knight, and they are in fact virtually indistinguishable from mounted nobility. And whenever we look at iconography, it's not that easy to know which of these heavily armored knights is actually knighted and which is a veteran, successful man-at-arms. The chivalric orders of the late Middle Ages formed by progressively incorporating various elements tied to religious narratives, and when they didn't go as far as to present themselves as genuine armed monastic and priestly orders, as a member of the upper class, the knight must also embody superior ideals, which in the Middle Ages could only be inextricably interconnected with Christianity. The rewriting of the memory of military brotherhoods like those of Britain and the Carolingians, taken as models, whose characteristics became increasingly linked to themes of faith, such as the search of the Holy Grail or the defense of innocent from pagans, would prove functional to the growing opposition between the Christian West and the pagan Baltic world, but even more so with the Muslim East and Spain. Alright noble ones, but I hope that you enjoyed this video on the origins, development and evolution of the concept of the medieval knight. This should be considered as an introductory, surface level discussion, but if you're interested in this topic, do let me know in the comments below and leave a comment, and I will continue to make episodes when we will further focus on areas where, together with the reading of sources, we can develop a more cohesive and deeper discussion.
Usually when we imagine the medieval knights, particularly those of the late 15th century, donning their majestic full-plate armors, we either imagine them with the sort of armor that is characteristic of the style of southern Germany or the northern Italian Milanese style. But were there other styles, and what did the knights of other medieval countries look like? Hello noble ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and I reckon this is an extremely interesting topic. Generally speaking, we know about the Gothic style of the fluted armors with all those particular kinds of helmets like the sallet, like the Maximilian style of armor, and then we think of the Italian rounded and smooth armors. Usually when they wear pauldrons, they are very big, the left one being bigger, the right one being smaller, so asymmetrical style with the armets and the wrapper around, ready for jousting, ready for war. But we never really stop to think, or at least I usually don't, where there are the styles. Because think about it. Okay, there were great armorers and great and very recognizable styles in Germany and Italy. But what about Spain? What about France, England, Luxembourg? There are so many other powers in the medieval period. Did they not have production? Well, of course, knights from these countries had their own productions, but did they look, basically, were they copies of the German and the Italian styles, or did they have their own flavor, their own take to it? And if they did, what did they look like? Well, this is not an easy question to answer because the archaeological evidence is scant, but we do know that there were other styles, and Dr. Tobias Capwell has done a great job with his book dedicated to the English style of armor to underline and bring forth or bring to light the English style. But in this video, we are looking at the Burgundians and their own special styles. What is Burgundy? Well, Burgundy, French Bourgogne, is a historical territory and a former administrative region of East Central France. So we're talking about French armor, but specifically about this section or this territory. Nearly everything in existence, as far as archaeological remains are concerned, is either Italian or German. We don't have much, so rather than looking at archaeology for this, we will have a look at iconography. Burgundy was a medieval state which rose like a star in the 14th and 15th centuries, and all of their fashion and courtly culture was exported all over Europe. France, the Holy Roman Empire, they all wanted to be like the Burgundians, specifically the Burgundian court. Even Toussaint in The Witch's Book and media is based off Burgundy. Wouldn't that kind of culture, which by the way is also very military oriented, have a particularly peculiar different style of armor? But my answer is yes, and I'll try to prove it and defend my thesis on this video. We're talking about a rich state, fashion icon, and when I say rich, I mean rich, like really, really rich. I mean, just to give you a bit more perspective, they owned the extremely rich cities of Flanders. Now, there are some great sources that can help us visualize and imagine in a historically accurate way how these knights were, what they looked like. And one of these is an incident that happened, and it's very well detailed, to Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy. Now, I'll tell you all of this story, but before I do that, I'd like to mention the sponsor that made this video possible. Now, noble ones, if you've got some spare time and you've been looking for a book to read and you think, you know, I'd like to find a good fantasy novel, but not just any novel. I want a book that once I start reading and I reach page 3, it will just hook me to the point that I just can't stop reading. And if that's what you're looking for, I have got it for you. Now, this book is called Virgin Killer, Sick with the Fairies. And don't let the title fool you. This is the craziest high fantasy novel writing that I've ever seen. Like, honestly, Mr. John Stone, you've got it. You see, Mr. Stone contacted me and said, hey, Metatron, I'd like to sponsor one of your videos. In return, I'd like you to just, show my book and perhaps put links in the description. That's all I want, and that would be great and would be grateful. In fact, that's what this was going to be at first. But here's the thing, as you probably know, I usually don't talk about something that I don't know anything about, so I decided to read, and if it doesn't catch me, it doesn't catch me. But as I reached page 3, I was absolutely hooked. I just couldn't stop reading. I'm halfway through the book and I love it. Every single page of this book is a treasure filled with the craziest, wacky world of magical creatures you could ever think. Like, some of the creatures that he came up with are absolutely, I was like finish a page and I'm like, what did I just read? I don't know how to do it justice, and I'm not paid to say this. I was just paid to show the book. But I want to say this. In fact, I'm actually getting a copy for my girlfriend because this book is giving me a lot of it. It's an experience. The percentage of humans that you will find here is incredibly low. Generally speaking, you'll be seeing like merchants who are like pig men, and then you'll find frog women. You'll find the Knights of the Round Cheese, who are actually made of cheese. Which is like insane. And then there will be like these special guards who are ostriches and they use beak swords. It's as if a Disney cartoon, a Miyazaki Hayao anime, and Dark Souls had a threesome and produced it. Like, literally. I'll tell you more about the story and the protagonist towards the end of the video, so stick towards the end. There will also be a bonus clip from the author. But I really want to suggest you check this book out. You'll find links in the description below. Absolutely worth it. This is full of dirty humor, horror. It's like a great mixture, a great concoction. Loving it, every page of it. Back on our topic. Okay, welcome back. So let me tell you this interesting incident, this little story that has to do with Charles the Bold, Duke of Burgundy. So you have to understand that Charles the Bold was a very powerful man. He was very wealthy. So you could imagine this man has literally everything he wanted, and yet that's not the case. There was one thing that he did not have, and he never will have, and that he really wanted, and that was being king. He wanted the title of king, so he would have really liked if he could receive the title of king of Burgundy. Now, who do you ask for such a thing? Well, of course you can't ask the king of France, because I mean, he's a king already, and that would mean independence for Burgundy, most likely. So no, he decides, hey, I'm going to ask the Holy Roman Emperor. Now at this time, the Holy Roman Emperor was Frederick III. We're talking about the father of Maximilian I, very famous. So he decides, I'm going to go to meet the emperor. And where do they meet? Well, they meet in the German city of Trier, which is basically not far away from the border with Luxembourg. So as they go, this is how the sources describe this man. So he was wearing a fully gilded armor. Now already picture that. The entirety of his harness is fully gilded, covered in gold. On his helmet, he has got as a crest a ruby the size of the head of a child. All of his garments are stitched and filled with pearls. The very detailed account also tells us that he brought with him many knights with all of their gear and all of their kits in their splendor. He carried the treasure of Burgundy with him, and he also carried a fleur de lis, so the kind of symbol of France, entirely made of silver, the size of a man. What a show-off. Did he actually get what he wanted? No. I mean, the Holy Roman Emperor was a very pragmatic man, as far as we understand. He actually was, on that day, he was just wearing his morning gown. Imagine that. Like, the freaking Duke of Burgundy looked more like an emperor than the actual Holy Roman Emperor. Anyways, it doesn't really matter the fact that he didn't get the title of king. What matters about this story, what we can learn from this story, is how incredible Burgundian knights looked. What an interesting event. Let's have a look at the source material. Now, there are military ordinances that can help us. So what is a military ordinance? Well, from a medieval perspective, they are basically papers that structure, in this case, the Burgundian military rules and requirements. In other words, the king brings up the rules you have to follow in order to join the military, go on campaign and whatnot. These state that you have to bring for yourself an armor, horse armor or barding, a mace, a long sword, an arming sword, a dagger, squires, soldiers, and they all have to be fully kitted, fully equipped. And it also specifies what they need to wear, some of which are actually quite interesting. For example, archers in the Burgundian army are supposed to wear long swords, which I mean, mind-blowing on its own. This is from the ordinance from 1474. We have great sources from 1460s, from the 1470s. There is no personal heraldic color. Knights can retain their heraldry, but the color needs to be uniform. In fact, this could well be the beginning of the concept of a military uniform. I don't have enough data to back that one completely, but it is a possibility, and are very interesting at that. The Ordonnance d'Abbeville 1460s tells us that soldiers would all wear white and blue jackets with red Andreas crosses. The knights specifically had to have vermilion velvet crosses, which they were given to wear over their harnesses, and plumes of white and blue on their helmets and their horse armor. Fascinating. There is a text source of Duke Philip the Good ordering a bard horse armor made in the style of a Brigandine in 1445. Now imagine that, a whole horse harness, basically like a Brigandine. My gosh, if someone can pull that off, it definitely has to be the Burgundians. We'll see why in a moment. Velvet horse, gilded rivets, plumes, it must have looked outstanding. To be honest, I've never heard of anything like it from any other European sources. We see that even soldiers often have plumes on their helmets, and you see that some sallets have got banners on top. These are used to mark on the field lieutenants or sergeants, such as a 3rd Company 7th Battalion and whatnot. Basically, these little flags that you see on top of the helmets, they work like the centurion's crests of the Roman army. They indicate your officers. Very well structured and organized army. A lot of Brigandine is worn. Now, this is interesting because it's in contrast with the German soldiers, for example, whom nearly never wear Brigandines in the late 15th century. As a matter of fact, I don't know of any evidence for it. Please let me know if you do know of any. So a big difference between France and Germany in the Middle Ages. The tapestries made for Charles the Bold show very beautiful, exquisite armor. They show antique scenes, so you do need to be careful, but the Burgundian love for such things show. So if we take these ornate knights and the vivid description of the splendor of the knights, we might get the idea that there could have been a specific fashion, a very pompous, flamboyant one at that. Burgundian knights loved showing off their wealth on the field, probably even more than any other knight in the medieval period. So, as an outcome of our little research together, knights have red velvet crosses as a specialty of the uniform of the Burgundian army. Salads have got flags, which are used to identify captains and other kinds of officers, possibly a wearing of heroic, quasi all'antica armors by Burgundian knights to allure to the classical period, seemingly a very strong interest towards richness, such as gilded armor, velvet in multiple colors and the like. And, as I said, the multiple usage of Brigandine both for the knights, soldiers and even horses. Now, some of the images that you're seeing today, such as this one, are actual pencil drawings. I'm not joking. They were made by my friend Michele. He has a channel. He draws loads of knights and medieval soldiers, the majority of which are historically accurate. There's also got some fantasy stuff. But if you're into that kind of stuff and you want to see how these drawings were made, check out his channel, link in the description below. These images were also based on a great reenactors company called Compagnie 9e. Great Burgundian knight reenactors with incredible kits. So this is pretty much what I wanted to talk about today. I don't have any more information to relate because unfortunately, as I say, the sources are kind of scant. But as far as I understand, I think we do have enough. But I think we have gathered enough data to be at least intrigued by this Burgundian knight and their splendor. Now, as I mentioned, this video was sponsored by the Virgin Killer, and I'd like to show you a brief video that can introduce a bit more the protagonist of this book. Let's check it out. But if you have other ideas and you've got something else you wanted to add to what I said, or perhaps you don't agree with what I said, let me know in the comments below. It's always nice to have a little bit of a conversation in the comments, and I will see you soon for my next video. And remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye.
This video is brought to you by Atlas VPN. If I was asked to say the first word that comes to mind when I think of the medieval joust, well, I would say epic. I mean, two medieval knights in full armor with lances going at each other, you can't get more epic than that. But what would be a close second? Would the word dangerous be fitting? In other words, how dangerous was the medieval joust? Hello noble ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and understanding how dangerous the medieval joust was in actual statistical terms is not easy task. In fact, this video should be considered to be more of a thought provoker, if you will. But if you try and Google this question, the answers that you get. Okay, check this out. People ask, what are the most common injuries in jousting? Men often were bruised, skewered, and decapitated during jousting matches. Often. I love how it goes from often bruised, which I mean, you would think, well, yeah, often bruised, you know, they go with each other, to often decapitated. Yeah. Let's click this thing. Let's see where it goes. 451, unavailable due to legal reason. What, did they all get arrested for it? Well, good. Figures. Well, how about we try and answer this really interesting question, jumping right into the sources I'd rather believe, medieval people themselves. I personally know of no dedicated and systematic database analysis on casualties for the Joust of Peace over the centuries, neatly divided by country, period and typology, as it should be. Therefore, for this video we'll be examining contemporary sources to see how they report the injuries and their severity. One thing we know is that both light and severe injuries during tilting were at least relatively common, and death was not unknown. So what we have to work with is a lot of isolated or incidental evidence of injuries and even deaths at tournaments, but this is far from being a comprehensive data set that will give us precise results. Moreover, when working with events from vastly different time periods and radically different environments, we'll have to take into consideration the fact that we will inevitably run into a lot of different variables. But does the data we have today enable us at least a rudimentary or generic analysis? As we put together the anecdotal accounts we have access to, we also have to consider other possible venues of relevant information. How does literature talk about the joust? And what was the general perception of the common people in medieval Europe? As one last point when it comes to the methodology utilized during this video, experiential knowledge would be a fantastic piece to add to our puzzle, so it would be splendid if more specialized channels such as Modern History TV with Jason or also Zach Evans were to make a response video and perhaps talk more about their own experiences when it comes to the possible dangers that they have faced themselves when they tried the joust. But for now, let's have medieval people talk. Chronicles of joust from the period may provide us with some interesting data we can use to help with our quantification of danger and severe injury probability within the medieval joust. Particularly in the late medieval period, some joust events were meticulously recorded, and today I'd like to read from a Spanish source. Pero Rodriguez de Lena, a royal notary from Castilla, mid-15th century, recorded detailed account of the Paso Honroso, an important event which took place in La Provincia de León, 1434, which of course included jousting. On this description he talks about injuries, deaths, armor failures, which were all described in detail. He recorded 724 courses in which 165 lances were broken. Alright, as we calculate this, 724 courses, 165 lances got broken. That's about 23% of all lances used during these courses resulted in a broken lance. Now, of course, this item of information doesn't necessarily mean that more injuries occurred as a result. All it tells us really is that these people were pretty good, since breaking the lance is what you want during a tourney. Of course, occasionally you would have a dismounting, but what you want to score a point is to break a lance. Still, a small possible correlation could be present, because if they hit each other a lot and well, with enough force behind properly executed technique, this might result in injury, particularly if the lance breaks on your face instead of your shield, as we will see. But this of course is a speculative observation of mine, so take it with a grain of salt. Also considering the fact that some of the injuries described occurred precisely because the lance didn't break. So we read. Spear penetrates eye slot near the target's left eye and draws blood. Victim claims, "'Tis nothing, 'tis nothing." Minor wound on the inner parts of the left gauntlet. The unfortunate Asbert de Clermont is struck through the eye slit with such a mighty blow that he pushed the entire head of the spear through his left eye into his brains. Right arm pierced near the armpit, great loss of blood, victim feigns, bystander feigns. Well, yeah. Gaping wound to the bicep with a palm's length of the broken spear pierced through to the other side. Okay, let me say this. A guy just got his head penetrated and clearly died because, I mean, without brains you can't live. Well, actually, scratch that. The website that we read just a moment ago, most likely written by brainless people. But I digress. So, people do get injured, and sometimes horribly. I mean, someone just died with a lump through their head, and the first night we read, he almost got hit in the eye. He got like the lump through the eye slit, and he just goes, "'Tis nothing, 'tis nothing." These people were badass. I'm starting to think that this scene from Monty Python, although being sarcastic, perhaps was actually based on an historically accurate attitude towards these kind of duels. Think about that. Now, if you found any of this interesting, well, there is much more to come, as we will see after a brief word from the kind sponsor that made this video possible, Atlas VPN. Now, if you're like me and you like to surf the internet looking for interesting historical information, it's a great idea to do it in safety, which is why you should totally use today's sponsor, Atlas VPN. A VPN is a virtual private network that makes all of your internet traffic travel through an encrypted tunnel, and this way it protects you from spying, public Wi-Fi dangers, it hides your IP address, and online activities. Atlas VPN is a great choice because it was developed by cyber security specialists, and among other things, it gives you access to the Data Breach Monitor, which is a security feature designed to track any data breaches related to your online account, automatically scanning any leaked information. But another add-on through Atlas VPN is the fact that you can use Netflix from any countries, regardless of where you are. So let's say that you wanted to watch a show that is only available in the UK, but you live in America. No problem, just change your country through the VPN and boom, access granted. I always have Atlas VPN active on my machines, and that is because one account lets you use multiple devices. I personally really like Atlas VPN not only because it's a great choice, but also because it's really affordable, and that links to today's special offer. Get the Christmas price cut. That's $1.70 a month for 3 years plus 6 months for free. If you've been considering getting a VPN but you weren't sure about the prices, then now is the time. And don't forget to click the link in the description. That's $1.70 a month for 3 years plus 6 months for free. Keep in mind that this is a time-limited offer, so be quick and click the link in the description. And big thanks to Atlas VPN for sponsoring my video. Arm in doublet and shirt penetrated beneath the right pauldron. Is my arming doublet thick enough? Squire? Spear skates into the right biceps and breaks. Victim is wounded twice in the biceps and has his hand dislocated, either from the spearhead, a splinter of the spear, or his own grapper breaking. Spearhead penetrates the right arm near the shoulder joint next to the armpit in such a way that the spearhead poked through to the other side. Holy mother of... which caused a gaping wound and a lot of blood flowed out of it. Victim dazed for a while in the lists. Hit on brow, victim suffers moderate reversal of fortune. Victim hit on bever, suffers moderate reversal of fortune. Stroke on the wrapper of the armet, moderate reversal of fortune. Okay, let me tell you this. Next time I suffer any form of injury, whether it be me falling down the stairs or perhaps falling from a freaking skyscraper, or, the worst of all, hit my little toe against the omnipresent piece of furniture at night in any house, I'm gonna say, oh, I just suffered a moderate reversal of fortune. 'Tis nothing. Stroke on the wrapper of an armet, moderate reversal of fortune. I'm starting to think that reading medieval sources might not be the best thing when it comes to the quality of my social life. Good thing I'm already married. Victim hit in the teeth with the same blow, and he stunned him and made him suffer a serious reversal of fortune, and from the point at which he was struck up to the head of the list, he almost fell off his horse. So you hit a knight on the teeth, and he almost falls. Goodness gracious, these people. Moderate reversal of fortune, and his opponent dislocates his hand. Yeah, I wonder what the parameter is for when something is moderate and when something is serious. I mean, if, you know. Self-inflicted serious reversal of fortune. What? Did he push like down, square and circle? What happened? Well, let's see. When jouster hits the tilt, he hit the tilt, the barrier. That's what he hit the tilt, and lodges the butt of his own spear between the front arcan of the saddle and the skirt of the cuirass over his belly. How did that happen? So that if he had not collided with the tilt, both horse and rider would have almost certainly have fallen. So he just, nothing serious, just hit the frigging, yeah. A hit on the bever stunned him and made him suffer a serious reversal of fortune. Listen, I don't care. Hate me all you want. I'm never wearing a bever and a salad during a joust. It's either a frog mouth for me or I'm not tilting. Victim who was recovering from a previous injury stunned for a moment in the list. This is so interesting, because we often think about how blunt impact, even though you've got a helmet, might stun you for a moment. But I find it so fascinating when it's actually medieval people, specifically an eyewitness during a joust, that mentions that this in fact happened. Then it just has more charm to it, doesn't it? And value. Breastplate punctured on both sides. Judges insist on repair. Left pauldron disgarnished. I love how the judges had to insist on the repair. So this guy's breastplate was punctured, I suppose, on both sides, and he's like, it's probably another one of those, 'tis nothing. And the judges are like, no, mate, you've got to stop, just stop him. Can you repair? Just force it. Just repair it. Just do it. I mean, the more I read this, the more I like knights. Pauldron laying disgarnished. Lance rest broken away. This is a lance rest, by the way. Imagine how powerful of an impact to break off a possibly steel lance rest. If this isn't hardcore, I don't know what is. Breastplate penetrated, repair necessary. Okay, so a small point on this penetration of breastplates. Of course, this shouldn't be interpreted, in my opinion, as, well, these people's breastplates were penetrated all the way through, because if they were, then we wouldn't be talking about repairing the breastplates, because, I mean, the knight would be out of action because he would probably be dead, unless undead knights are allowed in the joust, which I don't think. So when he says this, I think it means that the breastplate is punctured, of course not fully penetrated, but this still is very dangerous, because if you don't repair it, then, if an opponent's lance tip ends up going into the same spot again, then it could basically compromise the effectiveness of the entire suit of armor. So yeah, repair necessary. But lance rest broken, grapple and gauntlet disgarnished, pauldron disgarnished, counter wing broken off, basage of spolder disgarnished, pauldron disgarnished, penetrated breastplate must be repaired, guard brace cast to the ground, gauntlet reinforced struck off. I mean, this is great. It kind of reminds me of Soul Calibur, they go into pieces. Rondel bent in half. This is my therapy. Why do I like this so much? Do I need professional help? Bever knocked to the ground. Yeah, you enjoy your bever. Okay, I think we've read enough for now to just have an idea, but if you want to read the entirety of the accounts, I'll leave them in the description box. But I think this already speaks about the pivotal role armor had during the tournament, because all of these injuries, or the majority of these, would have been lethal if armor wasn't there, which kind of counters what I've already found, of course, in a separate article on Google where they say that the joust was dangerous because of the armor, so there is that. Dear Anglophone speakers, as a non-native speaker, I would suggest that you might need a new interpretation / definition of the expression no-brainer. It's your language, not mine. It is, however, very important to understand that as we read these sources, the very fact that all of these incidents were reported most likely speaks for their rarity, in the sense that they were worth noting. So these shouldn't be considered to be things that happened all the time, but these are sort of special moments that the author decided to write down because they would have been jaw-dropping for the medieval people too. But they did happen, and these do constitute some of the possible risks that you would face knowingly as a knight in the joust. And this speaks greatly of the sort of courage that knights in medieval Europe who participated demonstrated just by participating, surely having a full understanding of the stakes and risks. Also considering the obvious fact that medieval people didn't have access to modern medicine, and therefore some of these injuries would have been a lot more serious for them than it would be to us. Still much respect to modern jousters. To open an interesting and very relevant small parenthesis on this daring attitude in the face of danger, I'd like to briefly discuss this expectation of courage in a cultural medieval key. A certain level of social expectation when it comes to display of courage was absolutely exercised in Europe in the form of societal pressure towards the attitudes in the face of death demonstrated by knights, and also the denouncing of cowardice. In the 13th century, Ramon Lull wrote a literary work called Book of Knighthood and Chivalry, where he tells us what it meant to be a knight and brings forth the core values of the chivalric code. And among the many different expectations and duties that a medieval knight would have had, he also tells us, open quotes, knights ought to take coursers, that's war horses, to joust and go to tourneys. Courage was clearly celebrated in medieval chivalric literature too. In fact, we could say that bravery is a defining characteristic of the knight. As a matter of fact, one of the principal recurring themes that we see all across medieval literature when it comes to the medieval knight is that death and losing a battle was preferable to the shame of cowardice. We can see this in La Chanson de Roland, but we also see this in very famous works and legends such as the Arthurian legend, where, at least according to the version we read in Lancelot d'Aulac, the Lady of the Lake tells us, knights should be more afraid of suffering shame than of dying, and Lancelot agreed. I mean, if Lancelot agrees. Nice hair. Charney wrote a knight's own book of chivalry in the 14th century as a detailed treatise on the rights and responsibility of knighthood. The book includes instructions on how a lady should behave when she saw her knight honored by others, but the author, even though he clearly valued knights who were sort of veterans of actual battlefield more, he also has a lot of respect for knights to participate into the jousts. And I mean, it makes sense, we can respect that. I mean, I have a lot of respect for MMA fighters, but I mean, a veteran who actually went to war is like, wow. He also tells us, while the cowards have a great desire to live and a great fear of dying, wrote one knight, it is quite the contrary for the men of worth who do not mind whether they live or die, provided that their life be good enough for them to die with honor. As we dive into medieval literature even more deeply, we see that this general idea that a medieval knight is expected to be brave can also backfire. Jean Froissart reported the story of Woufflard de la Croix, who abandoned Sir William Balliol and their men while in battle. Shameful display. And fled into the marshes, where he was discovered by his enemies, who killed him, refusing to ransom such a coward. So if he hadn't ran away, maybe they would have, ransomed, but it is what it is. But we also see that this theme of bravery associated with knights is also found in more didactical texts. In the Livre de Chevalerie, Geoffrey de Charmy advised young men at arms who wanted to be strong and of good courage to fear shame more than death. Even Christine de Pizan was in fact drawing on even older principles, for example the De Re Militari by Vegetius, with the idea of retreating before the battle was seen as dishonorable. And she called upon noble men to be courageous for the following three reasons. For the sake of the prince, the country, and the chose publique, which, yeah, it's public thing, but it could be translated as the public good in this case. Still in the realm of teaching, but this time specifically about family matters, we read in the Enseignement Paternel, a text produced by Hugues de Lannoy, written in 1430s, that a man teaches his son that it's better to die honorably than to be shamed by cowardice, urging him to accept death in battle rather than to come back in shame. Could you imagine telling your own son that? I think this is interesting because it helps us understand that medieval knights were under double pressure from both sides. The aristocracy, the king, the prince, their fathers expected them to be brave, but so did the people who were expecting this sort of bravery from their betters. And since we are discussing the concept of courage in the face of danger when it comes to medieval battles, we cannot help but mention the late medieval king of Bohemia, Jean of Luxembourg. He was fighting for King Philip VI at the Battle of Crecy on the 26th of August in 1346. Now, in Jean Froissart's famous account, the blind Bohemian king, when I say blind, I mean he had contracted ophthalmia, an inflammation of the eye which can result in blindness, like in this case. So, the blind king rode into battle, led on either side by his retainers who had connected their horses to his to lead him. Together, they fought most bravely. His last words before the charge being, "Far be it that the King of Bohemia should run away. Instead, take me to the place where the noise of the battle is the loudest. The Lord will be with us. Nothing to fear. Just take good care of my son. The king died during the battle. Another aspect that can help us frame more correctly our assessment of how dangerous the medieval joust was in period is the response, at least when it comes to official responses, by the Catholic Church and the sort of bans that were sometimes issued by the ecclesiastical authorities. These tournaments were dangerous enough for the church at various times to call for bans on them periodically. That being said, the church condemned the vanity and immorality that surrounded the tournaments as much as the violence. So when we say dangerous, this doesn't only involve physical danger in this case, in the minds of the Pope. In 1130, Pope Innocent II proclaimed jousting was sinful and against the teaching of the Church. He banned tournaments and prohibited a proper Christian burial to those who lost their lives in the sport. The ban was lifted in 1192. Now, of course, this is an early 12th century type of joust, so it's very different to the late 15th century sort of regulations. We'll get to that in the next section, but I believe this is still pertinent, and there are a couple of things we need to say. Let's have a look at a few other bans so we can understand this in context. The Second Lateran Council, Canon 29 to be precise, under Pope Innocent II in 1139, banned the use of crossbows against Christians and archers. We prohibit under anathema that murderous art of crossbowmen and archers, which is hateful to God, to be employed against Christians and Catholics from now on. Also, Canon 14 forbids. We entirely forbid, moreover, those abominable jousts and tournaments in which knights come together by agreement and rashly engage in showing off their physical prowess and daring, and which often result in human deaths and dangers to the soul. So that's interesting that he says often when it comes to death, but of course, this doesn't necessarily need to be taken as a calculated statement with actual statistics in mind. It's from his perspective. Still interesting though, should be noted. I also want to read Canon 12, you'll see why in a second. We decree that the truce is to be inviolably observed by all from sunset on Wednesday until sunrise on Monday, and from Advent until the octave of the Epiphany, and from Quinquagesima until the octave of Easter. In other words, they were trying to restrict warfare from Monday to Wednesday. Now, what's important to understand about these bans is even though they were put into effect, a lot of people completely ignored these. So, were Christians still using crossbowmen and archers against each other? Absolutely. Did they actually follow this instruction en masse? All countries, when it comes to not having war if on a Friday or a Thursday, no, they still did it. And in the same way, a lot of people still did the jousts, no matter what. The majority of knights still jousted, regardless of what the Pope thought. But even though a Pope could have a strong disdain for jousts and tourneys, we shouldn't imagine all of Christendom united in such a condemnation. Indeed, both in literary productions and writings within the Church's priesthood ranks, we still find plenty of supporters of the joust, even from a religious perspective. As we read, Charney tells us, God is gracious towards those who find their life of such quality that death is honourable, for the said men of worth teach you that it is better to die than to live baselessly. Yet Matthew Paris, a monk who wrote in the 13th century, called tournaments a bloody sport indeed. So, variable opinions. Now, there are several chronicles that sometimes bring forth numbers that are in fact sort of difficult to believe. There is, for example, a German chronicler from 241 that tells us that during a tournament event, there was a staggering number of 80 knights and squires who were killed during the tournament. But is this real? Are these numbers exaggerated? Of course, this could be a case of shock factor by exaggeration. At the end of the day, we know that one thing the medieval chroniclers did was to increase, for example, the number of deaths during battles and battle reports. So why wouldn't they do it also for tourneys and jousts? But also, we have to consider another possibility. It also depends on how massive of an event we are talking about and for how many days, if not weeks, this event continued. So there is a huge difference in the number of deaths and injuries, in fact, not necessarily deaths, but even injuries between a private or even public personal duel or some sort of like little event, a regional event, an international event, and even more so, all the way up to the sort of incredible and very illustrious and expensive events organized by the Medici family as a way to show their power and wealth in Florence in late medieval Italy. And it is also important, as I mentioned before, to discuss, well, what sort of period we are specifically talking about, because indeed the very early types of tournaments were more of a sort of mock battle between two actual armies that, even though their objective wasn't to kill each other, still it was basically almost unregulated. They were trying to ransom and kidnap other people so that they could take or strip them of their armor and then sell it back on, or sort of have a ransom. And even though you're using blunt weapons, I mean, you can still kill someone, particularly if there is a massive battle going on. But then again, as joust becomes more sophisticated and it becomes more of a event with pageantry and ladies and music, also to celebrate, for example, weddings, as we were mentioning, then that's a different thing, because there is a whole new level of organization. So we see that definitely there would have been a higher level of injuries, even serious injuries and death in early jousts, which could also connect to the fact that the church was like, hey, you've got to relax. And then as we go forward all the way up to the late 15th century and early 16th century type of jousts, which were now not perfectly safe, because we still have several accidents, but it's definitely safer in a comparative key to the early types of tournaments. And one last aspect that we need to underline is the fact that, of course, the death of a baron will definitely be recorded, but perhaps the death of a simple or lower ranked knight might not be. Also, the development of specialized jousting armor, which was thicker, heavier, more protective, was in a way a confirmation of what was considered to be a very dangerous sport. In 1501, regardless of such precautions, 5 participants were killed in a tournament in Rome. In 1524, Henry VIII was nearly killed in a tournament when the visor of his helm came open and he was hit in the face by splinters from a broken lance. In 1559, Henry II of France was less fortunate after he decided to take one more run at the end of a tournament. The constable, de Montgomery, shattered his lance on the king's shield in an accident, and a splinter from the broken lance entered the king's visor, fatally wounding him. Now that we have gone through several reports, what sort of specific physical dangers should we expect from such a hardcore sport? Well, blunt trauma, bruises, lacerations, concussions, broken bones, similar injuries, external injuries, internal injuries, dislocations, possible dislocated shoulders, extensive loss of blood, fatigue, thirst, overheating and abrasions, armor failures, saddle failures, in general equipment failures, and falls. There is also another type of danger which is mentioned in the sources and sometimes was taken very seriously by some medieval monarch, which doesn't really have to do with accidents but with intent. As we have mentioned, sometimes people who held a grudge, oftentimes also in connection with a lady, would use tournaments, tourneys and jousts as an opportunity to actually legally kill their opponent because they had a grudge with him or because they hated him so much. So these things also happened. They're of course frowned upon and heavily condemned in the sources, but if they mention them, it means that some knights just went a little nuts on each other. So, all in all, was the medieval joust dangerous? Absolutely. Was it more dangerous than even modern hardcore reproduction of the joust? I would say so. But it is absolutely something that requires more research, and we need more data to be able to give specific statistical numbers. But of course, I want to know after this presentation what you think. Do you have more things that you can bring to the table? Absolutely do it in the comments below and let's have a very interesting discussion. How high do you think, from a percentage standpoint, was the possibility of you dying if you participated into a joust, and what was the level of severe injuries that you could more likely expect to suffer, as opposed to the lower or lesser injuries? And last point, up to what extent, how high was the level of tolerance of risk from the perspective of medieval people when it comes to injuries that they would consider to be a lower injury, but for us that might already be something that could disqualify the whole sport, considering modern regulations of safety. But absolutely let me know in the comments below. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please remember thumbs up, and if you're not yet members of this community, become a noble one. Subscribe to my channel for more content from the Metatron. Don't forget to click the link in the description below to take advantage of the amazing offer by Atlas VPN. And as always, thank you very much for watching, and remember, the Metatron has spread his wings. Goodbye.
First of all, let's start with the aesthetics. I think the Lorica Segmentata is an absolutely beautiful, beautiful armor. It's relatively simple in its design, and yet, I don't know, it's probably the big shoulders, it's the overall look, the mixture of all the different kinds of metals, because of course in my case this is steel, and then you've got brass and pure copper in here. The originals could have been iron, it could have been steel. Generally speaking, we don't know exactly what if they used brass, if they use bronze, or if they use just pure copper like in my case. The Brigandine, I think, just wins it as far as the aesthetics are concerned. I believe it's more aesthetically pleasing, and don't get me wrong, exposed plates of the Segmentata are incredible, I love them, but it's just this blue. In all seriousness, I think it's just the pattern of the rivets, it's the contrast between the brass and the hand-spun silk velvet. I just find it absolutely beautiful, and it's also the shape. I believe it's the tight waist, which, I mean, my Brigandine, with the help of a belt, will achieve even a better look, but in general, the fact that we've got this hourglass shape, which for Europe is very much of a 14th century and then even more exaggerated late 15th century look, is what really gives it that pleasing aesthetic. In terms of mobility, Lorica Segmentata affords me a lot of mobility, and I have to say that compared to my Brigandine, it does allow me a tiny little bit to close my arms further, but yet I have to say that the Brigandine wouldn't really disturb me at all. So they both work very well. In terms of mobility, I'm gonna say they are on pair. It's not really the Brigandine that kind of blocks me a little bit here, it's the arming doublet. So if the arming doublet was slightly larger, I believe I could achieve complete mobility, but not that I really need to get my arms all the way up here, and as you can see I still can. It's just a little tighter, but that's the doublet, it's not even the armor. And when I do this, again, it's very, if I push it a bit, it's basically the same. So I want to say they are equal. Weight distribution is one of the main problems with Lorica Segmentata, although I'd like to underline that by the way I'm talking about it now, it might sound like I don't think that Lorica Segmentata is a good invention, but it is. It's an excellent armor for its time. But in terms of weight distribution, yes, you can wear it on a super malis. Yes, if it's fitted to you, and you also wear a nice tight cingulum militaris, you can wear it all day. I mean, they did. But when I wear my Brigandine, I noticed that it just feels better. The overall weight, particularly on the shoulders for my Segmentata, is a bit of a problem. You can feel it, and that's because of the fact that all the mass of the shoulders is just right here. In terms of weight distribution, the Brigandine shines. I have literally no weight on my shoulders, almost nothing, because of the fact that I have this hourglass shape, and because of its construction, all the weight is in the center of mass, exactly here at my natural waist. And so I can wear this for a lot longer, and it feels, even though the weight is similar, it feels a lot lighter. Protection is the next thing I'd like to talk about. Now, Segmentata is a very protective armor, and it was in fact an improvement, particularly against penetration, compared to other sorts of armor, such as the so-called Lorica Hamata or mail. So in terms of protection, Segmentata protects you well, and it does have some overlapping, particularly in the center. In fact, one thing I'd like to say that I have noticed people saying multiple times, particularly in reenactment fairs and sometimes even YouTube videos, that a Segmentata does have a hole, or there are gaps in the center of the armor, and I've even heard people trying to justify that by saying, oh no, but that's because you can protect it with your shield. Absolute nonsense. Segmentata, if it has a gap in here, it means it's not fitted well, or it hasn't been closed well. If it's properly fitted and it's properly fastened, Segmentata has no gaps in the center. I mean, that would make absolutely no sense. The core of the armor, the center of mass, is where the armor needs to protect you the most. Also, the shoulders are particularly protective for a whole range of reasons that I will touch upon on a dedicated video that I'm working on and will be published soon on the channel. But generally speaking, Segmentata does have a little bit of overlap in the center, and it does have some overlap in the shoulders, and it is quite protective. Now, in terms of protection, the Brigandine is interesting because my Brigandine, in this case, the thickness of the plates, which are hardened and tempered spring steel, differs. The front has got two main solid plates, and they are the thickest in the entirety of the armor. But as you go towards the sides and the back, the overall thickness of the plates decreases and tapers down. And that is because this is the part that I most likely will need the armor to be most protective, whereas on the sides and for my personal choice in the back, I've got thinner plates. The thinnest are on the sides, and this is coherent with actual real armor of the time, and it helps because it still protects you, but it helps to reduce the overall weight. In fact, in terms of weight, my Brigandine is lighter than my Segmentata. Also, in terms of construction, this is a lot more complex. To achieve a Segmentata, you need exactly 38 plates. To create a Brigandine like mine, which is based on the Leeds example, you need 140 plates. So you understand it is a lot more labor intensive. Last but not least, the closing mechanism. Now, for generally speaking Segmentata, the pectoral plates are closed shut by buckles and straps. Now, my type, which is a Corbridge type B, but that will be the same for Corbridge type A, it's laced up. That's how you close it. Although the way I've done it here, not exactly historical. A more historically plausible, although we don't know 100%, but a more historically plausible way would be to individually fasten each girth hoop. But this doesn't really matter for our discussion because the Segmentata Calcrise type will instead have buckles and straps, so that's also a possibility. The only real difference is the fact that a Segmentata closes both in the front and in the back. So it's not a flawed design, it works quite well. Now, as far as the fastening method is concerned, as I said, for the Segmentata, we've got straps and buckles. It's very similar, and some Brigandines would close at the back, some on the side, some on the front. It very much depends. Very, very similar. These are very sturdy in this example here. Another thing that is important to say is that the armor overlaps in the center. This is something that was actually asked to me by one of you in the comments section of my latest video on the Brigandine, and I do want to show you this, how it works. So as you can see, when I open it up, you can see that there is a series of plates in here that sort of protrude, and as these go inside, they will overlap with this part of the plates here. So you've got literally extra plates exactly for that reason. So when the Brigandine is closed shut, even though it might appear that you could slit a blade in between the two areas that meet here, the two rims or edges. That's actually not the case, and that's why these extend here to make sure that not only you can't slip anything through, but you also have two layers of protection in the very central core of the body armor.
Maybe get the mic. Professional YouTuber. Hello number ones, welcome back to my channel. This is the Metatron speaking, and were medieval knights jacked? Define jacked. Okay, so today's video has to do with a little bit of a curiosity, if you will. A question that I think often many of us, including you, have asked, or perhaps just wondered. And in order to respond it, we're going to jump into the sources, iconography, manuscript illuminations, and a little reason and logic. So, if by jacked you mean this, then the answer is probably not. Already the first thing we need to take out the window, of course, is anything from the bodybuilding world that isn't natural. Of course, the occasional really big guy would have been a thing. Absolutely. In fact, we know from records that in the medieval period, we had more giants and more midgets, meaning that gigantism and dwarfism were not treated as they are today, and therefore you could have had a really big guy. Now, with the obvious out of the way, when we look at iconography to try and figure out what is the average physique and looks, appearance of a medieval knight, we come into contact with a problem. The problem being that they are usually dressed. Either they are clad in armor, like in this case, who the heck knows what kind of muscularity this guy has, since he's literally covered in steel. And this tends to happen even if we go all the way back to something like the Bayeux Tapestry, 1066. I mean, this is a war scenario, so of course you're not going to see anyone shirtless. This is in the Gauls. However, in general, even if we for a moment look at proportions, sizes, it does appear that we have relatively slender physiques. and man, sucks to be him. The other situation that we encounter oftentimes is to see nobles and knights dressed but not in battle gear. And this is a good example here. We only have one individual who's wearing what appears to be some sort of placard created in Brigandine style, but the rest of the medieval individuals, men, that we have here are all wearing arming doublets, and of course we are in the 15th century. Now, I own a very similar style of doublet myself that was based on the paintings by Piero della Francesca, Tuscany, late 15th century, and as you can see already, one thing that I do appreciate apart from the colorful repertoire that we see, I love the fact that most of them, in fact, is it all of them? It is all of them, except for this guy, are wearing a hat to complete the outfit. I also appreciate that there is a certain palette, like it's intentional. I love that. And there is a lot of long hair. Now, given whether the hair is long or it's short, it's a little bit of a perspective situation, isn't it? Maybe for you, these guys have long hair when it's down to their shoulders, but for me, were you talking about long down to the shoulders? Come on, give me a break. Yeah, life is perspective, isn't it? Let's say longish. I'll give him longish. Anyways, if we look at the physiques once again, one thing you will notice is a tight waist, right? So these guys here, they might have muscular arms. In fact, this man here, the one with the beard, seems to be gripping the bicep of this guy. And, there is stuff to grip, I think. So maybe they have biceps, triceps, maybe some shoulders. Still, not a huge bodybuilder style of physique, if you will. Now, as I was saying, a lot of iconography shows them in full armor, but there are some exceptions. These exceptions are a thing when we involve rabbits, my friend. Rabbits. And to be precise,
kill the rabbits.
Yeah, believe it or not, this is a thing. Rabbits murdering everyone. It's either this is a trope, a joke that medieval people loved, or maybe there is something the government doesn't want you to know about our past. Regardless. So there is a guy here who's been beheaded, I guess, at the behest of this giant rabbit. And what can we say? Yeah, lean physique, tight waist, probably developed chest up to a certain extent, and by the way, his deltoids look, I would say he does have some shoulders, so overall an athletic, lean body, possibly with some muscle, but nothing huge, if you will. Here is another one who is dealing with the rabbits, but this one is particularly thin, maybe a biblical reference though, so there is that to be taken into consideration, because we can see his rib cage. This guy really needs to increase the protein intake. This guy here is being beaten to death and skinned alive. Goodness gracious, rabbits. We do see a little bit of a developed pec, maybe. Now, of course, it's not like we can trust the art to represent every single medieval person, and in fact, we can't even say that maybe this was average simply because it could be an artistic convention, or device, if you will, in the way people were represented when unclothed. It's an indication, but it's not like 100% representative. This one is 100% representative. Medieval knights were definitely muscular and physically powerful, but jacked in the modern bodybuilding sense, we would say not quite. Their physiques were built for function over form, creating a very different kind of strength than what we see in gyms today. It is highly likely that due to their constant training, knights did develop muscle mass. They used all sorts of weapon training, they were wearing their armor, training since they were 7, and in general, hand-to-hand combat does require a certain level of upper body and core strength, together with dexterity and being athletic and precision. Archaeological evidence from knight burials does show enlarged muscle attachments points on bones, indicating well-developed shoulders, arms, and backs. Their leg bones also often show signs of extensive horseback riding, with pronounced muscle markers from gripping with their thighs and controlling war horses. However, remember that a medieval saddle functions very differently to a modern saddle. Let me see if I can illustrate the point. Look at this image. If you look at the knights, they don't really appear to be seated in the way that a modern horse riding feels. If you really look at it, they appear to be almost standing. If you're enjoying this video so far, please take a moment to check out my Patreon page. With as little as a $5 support, you can help us ensure that we can continue to produce high quality and high researched content. And at the same time, you get access to polls, extra videos, unlisted streams, and much more. Thank you so much. Because of the way medieval saddles functions, the knight is using the horse as a fighting platform, but the position is really not the seated one. The legs are elongated and it's as if he's putting some pressure down here for balance and control. A medieval knight on a horse does appear to be almost standing. He's not standing, but almost. Therefore, while there might be a certain level of overlap between modern horse riding and medieval horse riding, they would not develop the exact same muscles. We also have to remember that in general medieval physiques looked different from modern fitness ideals. Knights likely had thick, strong muscle when it was in the functional areas, with a lower body fat percentage than regular average people today, due to the fact that they were constantly training, and their diets were not McDonald's and high sugar based. Now, all of that is fascinating, but what do the sources, specifically medieval period sources, say? Medieval artwork and literature occasionally do describe knights, and they tell us that they are physically impressive. Chronicles mentions knights who could leap into the saddle while fully armored, or even bend horseshoes with their bare hands. These, of course, are rare instances and proof of exceptionalism rather than norm. However, they do suggest that at least in the medieval mind, knights were known for exceptional strength, even by medieval standards. The knightly class also had access to better nutrition than most people, with regular meat, dairy, and varied diets that supported muscle development. It is very likely, in fact, that medieval knights would have been, on average, taller than commoners and peasants. Maybe not this much taller, though. Also, another thing that we tend to forget when it comes to the medieval world is the following. Not only they were constantly training, so we can see here I found another one that looks shirtless a little bit, and we see kind of reasonably broad shoulders up to a certain extent, but in general they train a lot, right? So you have to imagine that sword fighting, fencing, sure that there is the whole lever mechanics and the way you use the sword, but also there is grappling involved, as we can see here, and grappling in armor. So that must be, if you do this constantly, you have to develop strength and muscle. So in other words, maybe a medieval knight's physique would be in between a bodybuilder who trains for hypertrophy for certain muscle groups only, and a power lifter, someone who actually develops strength. Kind of an in-between, probably. But here's the other thing that we often forget, and it is crucial to this discussion. The world they lived in had a different type of physicality every day. Think about it this way. What do we do? With our jobs, spend most of our times sitting, maybe at a desk, at our computer. After the job, which is already quite sedentary, is over, the 9 to 5, what do? We drive home. We're sitting again. Then we get off the car. Do we go up the stairs? No, often we take a lift or an elevator. Then we are home, kick our shoes off, watch TV, and then in the evening we're back at the computer sitting. This is nothing like a medieval lifestyle. In the Middle Ages, a knight would have woken up in the morning, going up and down a monumental amount of stairs and towers already, if he lives in a castle. But then again, even if he doesn't live in a castle and it's a farmer, they're still going up and down the hills and walking around the forest, the woods. Walking, in fact, probably why they look so lean. They would have walked everywhere. So not only they are training for combat and making sure that they are fit, that they have power, that they have endurance, but they walk everywhere. They go up and down the stairs, then they go to church, right? So they're walking to church after they got dressed, and after church they're walking, or perhaps they're riding a horse. But then again, riding a horse, it's still a lot more physical than driving a car, isn't it? And so let's say that he's now riding a horse, and then he goes to the local inn, perhaps. Yeah, he will sit down, maybe they will dance after that. That's still physical. Then he will train, because that's part of his day. Then after the training is over, he has to walk all the way up the hill. Maybe then they will go on a hunt, and that's another physical one. Fox hunting, for instance, in the woods. Then they need to go to another town. It's not like they can drive there. So the physicality of the world in which they're in would put them in a position of being in a completely different level of athleticism, but also fitness than us, unless you're a fitness freak, and I know you are. Going back to the burials, there are several specific medieval knight burials that have been archaeologically examined, providing fascinating insights into their physical condition and lifestyle. For instance, the Hereford Cathedral Knight from England, 12th to 14th century. The most famous example is a 5-foot 8-inch man found at Hereford Cathedral, who was described as the most battered corpse on the site. with the largest numbers of broken bones. He had serious trauma to his right shoulder blade, 10 of his right ribs and left leg, suggesting extensive jousting injuries. He was probably around 45-year-old, and analysis of his teeth suggested that he was raised in Normandy and moved to Hereford later in life. When it comes to my position and suggestion that probably medieval knights and nobility would have been on average taller than the regular population, we have the Gdansk knight finding in Poland, 13th or 14th century, recently discovered under an ice cream shop. This knight measured 170 to 180 centimeters, so 5.7 to 5'11, making him taller than the average medieval European. And the bones in this case are in excellent conditions despite centuries underground. Last but not least, we have the examinations of the Cambridge medieval cemeteries, England from the 10th to the 14th century. This is a comprehensive study which examined 314 individuals from 3 Cambridge cemeteries. These burials reveal the medieval warriors often showed signs of significant trauma, robust muscle attachment points on bones indicating heavy physical activity, and heights that varied considerably. The bone evidence supports the idea that knights were indeed physically powerful, though their builds were likely more functional than purely aesthetic, shaped by constant training with weapons and armor rather than modern bodybuilding techniques. Alright, number ones, but I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please remember thumbs up, and if you have other questions, let me know in the comments below. Thank you very much for watching. Hey, noble ones. Medieval-inspired films, video games and novels have created this image of the knight in shining armor very vividly in our minds, and oftentimes together with his sword, horse and harness, long locks, dark or blonde, accompany this image of knightly aristocracy, giving it, we could say, a time long gone feel. Now, since I've rocked long hair already several times in my life, my question for you today is this. If I put myself in medieval plate armor and was sent to the medieval period, would I blend in, or would people think that I look weird? How real is this idea of knights in association with long, flowy hair? To approach this systematically, we first of all need to properly define the word long hair, identifying what we mean exactly. Because one of the things we'll see today is that since long and short hair are very loosely descriptive adjectives, our own culture and personal perspective shape and change their meaning, and in general, the mental image we perceive. Some people will describe this length of hair on a man as long hair already, while a very similar length of hair in a woman could be referred to as short. So for clarity's sake, even though with my current length we have a rather extreme example, we'll consider any length of hair that reaches the shoulders on a man as long. Of course, when we are discussing knights, we are referring to the medieval period. What's key to understand before we begin looking at iconography and reading period sources is the length of the Middle Ages. We are dealing with 1,000 years, and fashion changed a lot during this time. I mean, I'm sure any of you watching could spot a hairstyle from the 80s when put together with current hairstyles. And that's what, a difference of 40 years. So, precise timing is the first gear of our research mechanism today. Secondly, the geographical area, the culture of reference. A specific custom in, say, 11th century England won't tell us much about 15th century Italy or 13th century Spain. Alright, with all of that established, the shared elements in the mechanism that supported the social construct of the meaning of hair in the medieval period shall now be examined. Hair in the medieval period often had a distinctive function. This is why the look of any given character in iconography should be seen as multi-dimensional, both as an act of personal display and as a marker of identity. In other words, it helped dividing people based on their social status and social position within a rather complex feudal society. Hair could also indicate social rank and marital status. To fully understand how the mechanism operated, allow me to digress for a brief moment. The knight, alongside the monk and the ploughman, can be identified as some of the cultural archetypes of the Middle Ages. In a way, they embodied a certain level of solidity, a distinct corporeal identity. And monks are a great example of this because of the fact that they had to adopt a very distinctive hairstyle. And what the heck is this guy doing anyways? Gods! There is thus little doubt that hairstyles held significance to people in the past. Monks often wore a tonsure haircut, which imitated Christ's crown of thorns, and it seems like some believed that the bald part in the head allowed God to reach them more directly. Now, regardless people actually believed this or not, it was part of the vow to leave behind the secular world and become servants of God. Hence, we can already see that having a certain haircut in the medieval period could mean entering clerical status, which according to the law of the church, enshrined in the Council of Chalcedon in 451, decreed those that have become clerics, well, not that kind of clerics, or who have entered a monastery should neither enter the army nor take on secular honors. And sometimes I don't think people appreciate enough how much this idea of, if you have this haircut, it means you have already entered clerical status, was important in the medieval period. So much so that it was historically used as a weapon against people who, say, were opponents to the seat of a king. They were literally forced to take the haircut, because that already disqualified them for trying to become kings. There was a combination between hair and the production of identity. Men may have lived by the sword, but their social position could metaphorically die by the scissors. If there is one specific title in medieval society that is often connected with long hair, it's that of a king. Of course, this wasn't always the case, but we can find specific references to kings who did wear their hair long. There is a curious mention made by Gaius Sollius Modestus Apollinaris Sidonius, a 5th century diplomat and bishop, who tells us about the Merovingian kings, so the ruling family of the Franks from the 5th century to 751. He says, "The hair is never cut from the heads of the Frankish kings' sons. From early youth their hair falls gracefully over their shoulders. It is parted on the forehead and falls equally on both sides. It is with them a matter to which they give special attention. We are told besides that they sprinkled it with gold dust and plaited it in small bands, which they ornamented with pearls and precious metals." Now, to cross-reference with a different source about the same topic to give this more validity, we also have a Byzantine historian by the name of Agathias, and he tells us, "The practice of the Frankish kings never to have their hair cut. This custom has reserved this practice for royalty as a sort of distinctive badge and prerogative." We also have confirmation of this from the histories of Gregory of Tours, who tells us how important long hair was for the royal family of the Merovingian kings, and this is where we have mention of their rivals being forced to adopt tonsure. Now let's move spatially. What about the kings of Britain? The kings of Britain used their facial hair to create their own identity and to differentiate themselves from their predecessors. Henry III wore a short beard, as did Edward I, whilst Edward II wore a curled beard and a moustache with long curly hair. Edward III decided to wear his hair and beard even longer. Now, when it comes to the looks of knights, unfortunately evidence is fragmentary. So what we're going to do today is we're going to try and reconstruct this image ourselves. First of all, we can't help but mention the Norman knights and their special hairstyle. By looking at Norman iconography and also reading the description of Norman knights, we know that they chose to keep their hair very short. It was short at the top and shaved to the sides and the back. Somehow modern looking if you think about it. Now, this can help us to envision what a Norman knight looked like, but that was a characteristic of their culture and it kind of made them stand out. With that being said, what about the majority of knights? What about knights in England, knights in Italy, knights in Portugal, knights in Spain, knights in France? The first thing that we noticed is that we tend to see in the majority of iconography that knights with short hair are almost non-existent. They go from middle length to shoulder length. Many knights probably wore their hair long. Now, when it comes to my length, however, this is kind of rarer. It's not completely non-existent. There are representations of people wearing hair as long as mine, but it is very uncommon. And in the majority of scenes, when there is a medieval knight and a medieval woman, they both have long hair, but the medieval woman is the one with the longest hair. However, I did find some interesting exceptions to this. Look at this very curious piece of iconography. It appears as a normal image or illumination representing knights fighting. But did you notice it? Could you spot it? Look at the plaits or the braids. These knights definitely have hair that is at least as long as mine, if not longer. Who knows how many knights are hiding very long hair underneath their helmets that we just don't see. So shoulder length hair would have been common, medium length hair would have also been common, and very long hair in men who were knights was also possible. What I'm about to share now is my own personal opinion based on the research that I've done in these past few days for this video. But I do believe that the times that we find knights with very long hair, they would all be actual nobility. Probably professional men-at-arms would have had their hair medium or shoulder length, but the nobility would be the one that could afford to have even longer hair than that. Of course, I can't prove it, but I think it could logically make sense. I might be onto something here. Alright, but if Merovingian and British royals wore their hair long, if knights wore their hair long, how did common people wear their hair? There are some clues hidden in the law texts. The Salic law considers the sharing of a long-haired boy without consent of his parents a serious offence. Meanwhile, the Burgundian law code puts a hefty fine on giving a criminal or slave even so much as a wig, implying slaves had to remain short-haired or bald. Medium-length hair may therefore have been the status signal of a free man, although the commoner's hair would have been shorter than the royal hairdo. Now, to give you a little bit of personal experience, how problematic is it to have long hair and wear armor? Well, as long as it's properly maintained and it's properly tied up when you're getting ready to wear your helmet, it makes no difference whatsoever. I wouldn't go around fighting like this. If I were a medieval lord, I would probably wear it down if I'm just in the city in a context of peace, even with my armor on. But in anything that has to do with combat, whether it be war, judicial duelings, the joust, I wouldn't wear it down. If I wasn't wearing a helmet, I would pull it in a high ponytail, which we know people did, or I would pull it in a bun or a low ponytail, or a plait if I was wearing a helmet. In fact, if it were me, I would choose the plait. Alright, well I hope that you enjoyed this presentation so far, and if you did, let me know. I could make these not too often, but I do like the idea of making very long format videos like this as a deep dive into topics that we are interested in. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you very soon. Ciao.